Without me, she would be homeless on the street. My father smirked from the witness stand, adjusting his expensive silk tie. The judge looked down at the paperwork in front of her, then looked at me with complete bewilderment. "So they really do not know?" she asked. My father's high-priced lawyer frowned, puffing out his chest. "Know what, Your Honor?" The judge let out a heavy breath. "Actually, she owns the bank that holds all of your mortgages." I watched the color drain completely from my father's face. "My name is Penelope. I am 34 years old and I just legally evicted my entire family from our ancestral home." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The Fairfield County Civil Court was exactly as intimidating as it was designed to be, with its towering mahogany walls and echoing marble floors. But the chill in the massive room was nothing compared to the absolute ice radiating from the witness stand. Donovan Caldwell. My father sat there looking like the undisputed king of Connecticut real estate. He wore a custom-tailored suit that cost more than most people made in a month, exuding an arrogance that had terrorized our family for decades. We were here because he had filed an emergency eviction order against me. He wanted me forcibly removed from the Briarwood estate, the historic home my late mother had loved, the home I had quietly been living in, while the rest of the family treated me like a parasitic stain on their perfect image. Gideon, my father's aggressive and incredibly expensive defense attorney, paced in front of the stand. He was a man who thoroughly enjoyed hearing his own voice, and he was currently painting a masterpiece of fiction for the court. "Tell us, Mr. Caldwell." Gideon prompted, his voice dripping with practiced sympathy. "Why are we forced to take such drastic legal measures against your own flesh and blood today?" My father sighed, putting on an Oscar-worthy performance of an exhausted, heartbroken parent. "I love my daughter." "Your Honor," he said, looking earnestly at Judge Rosalind. "But there comes a point where tough love is the only option a father has left. I let her stay in the guest wing of the Briarwood estate out of pure charity. I thought she would use the time to get her life together. Instead, she squats in my $4 million property, refusing to leave, refusing to contribute, and holding my future real estate development plans hostage. She is a freeloader, plain and simple." Gideon nodded sagely, as if listening to a profound tragedy. "And does she have the financial means to secure her own housing?" My father let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed through the quiet courtroom. "With her pathetic call center salary, absolutely not. She answers phones for a living. She could barely afford a studio apartment in the worst part of town, let alone maintain a sprawling property like Briarwood." I did not react. I sat perfectly still beside my own attorney, keeping my hands neatly folded in my lap. Behind me in the gallery, I could hear the muffled, condescending chuckles of my younger sister Cassidy and her husband Andre. They had come specifically to watch the show. Cassidy was the family golden child, 30 years old, and draped in designer clothes she bought using our father's corporate credit cards. Next to her sat Andre, a junior corporate lawyer who used big legal words to bully people and brown-nosed my father at every given opportunity. They had come to see the family scapegoat finally get thrown out into the freezing cold. They thought I spent my days wearing a cheap plastic headset, apologizing to angry customers over the phone. They did not know that the call center I claimed to work at was actually the front desk of Obsidian Financial, the ruthless, distressed asset private equity firm that I had founded from scratch. They did not know that while they were spending money they did not have, I was quietly buying up the debts of the very people they rubbed elbows with at the country club. Judge Rosalind narrowed her eyes, peering over her reading glasses at the witness stand. "Mr. Caldwell, if your daughter's financial situation is as dire as you claim, why did you cut off her trust fund 10 years ago?" The question was a standard background inquiry, but my father seized it as an opportunity to inflate his own ego. "Because I refused to finance rebellion, Your Honor," he stated proudly, lifting his chin. 10 years ago, I arranged a highly advantageous marriage for Penelope. The son of my primary business partner was a respectable, wealthy young man. A union between our families would have secured her future and solidified my company's legacy. But Penelope refused. She decided she was too good for traditional family duty. She walked away from her responsibilities, so I cut her off completely to teach her a harsh lesson in reality. I listened to him summarize my entire trauma as a mere act of teenage rebellion. He conveniently left out that his business partner's son was emotionally abusive and that the forced marriage was nothing more than a financial transaction to save my father from a bad real estate deal. He also left out how the stress of his relentless control had caused me severe crippling anxiety, nearly breaking me before I found the courage to escape his grip. He thought my escape had led me to poverty. He thought cutting me off had forced me into a miserable minimum wage existence. Gideon turned back to the judge, dramatically waving a piece of paper in the air. As you can see, Your Honor, my client is the sole owner of the Briarwood estate. We submitted the 3-day eviction notice precisely according to state law. The defendant has completely ignored it. We ask the court to grant the eviction today and dispatch the county sheriff to remove her belongings immediately. Judge Roslin took the document from the bailiff, reviewed it carefully, then looked across the courtroom directly at me. Her expression was sharp and entirely unreadable. "Ms. Caldwell," she said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room. "Your father claims you are a freeloader refusing to vacate his property. You have heard his testimony regarding your finances and this eviction notice. Do you have a defense to present to this court today?" I looked at the piece of paper now projected on the court's monitor. It was an exact copy of the document that had started this entire war. A document I knew intimately. I did not look at the judge. Instead, I turned my head slowly and locked eyes with my father on the witness stand. I let a slow, chilling smirk spread across my face. To understand how we ended up in this echoing courtroom with my arrogant father entirely unaware of the catastrophic trap he had just walked into, we have to rewind the clock. We have to go back exactly 7 days. Back to the Caldwell family, Thanksgiving dinner where the very first shot of this war was fired, and where they handed me the matches I would use to burn their entire fake empire to the ground. The dining room of the Briarwood estate was suffocatingly warm, filled with the heavy scent of roasted turkey sage stuffing and simmering resentment. Crystal wine glasses caught the light of the extravagant chandelier overhead, and the antique silver cutlery clinked softly against fine china. It was the picture of old money Connecticut perfection. But underneath the surface, the Caldwell family was rotting from the inside out. My father Donovan sat at the head of the long mahogany table like a feudal lord surveying his domain. To his right sat my younger sister Cassidy, wearing a silk designer dress and a diamond tennis bracelet that I knew for an absolute fact my father had purchased using a high-interest corporate credit card. Next to her sat Andre, her husband. Andre was 35 years old, a junior corporate lawyer at Sterling and Partners, and a man who treated every family dinner like a courtroom where he needed to prove he was the smartest person in the room. He wore a bespoke suit to Thanksgiving dinner, desperate to fit into my father's wealthy aesthetic. And then there was me. I sat at the far end of the table, the designated outcast, the family disappointment, the daughter who had supposedly ruined her life 10 years ago by refusing to marry a man my father wanted to do business with. For the first half of the dinner, they played their usual games. Cassidy complained about the renovations on her new townhouse, fishing for our father to offer to pay for the custom Italian marbles she wanted. Andre nodded along, sipping an $80 glass of Macallan Scotch, occasionally dropping legal jargon into the conversation to ensure my father remembered how valuable it was to have a corporate lawyer in the family. They ignored me entirely, treating me like the hired help who had accidentally pulled up a chair to their feast. I ate my food in complete silence, watching their pathetic display of fake wealth. I knew exactly how deep in debt my father was. I knew exactly how many payments Cassidy and Andre had missed on their luxury vehicles. But they thought I was clueless. They thought I spent my days wearing a cheap plastic headset fielding angry customer complaints at a low-level call center. Then my father decided it was time for the main event. Donovan wiped his mouth slowly with a linen napkin. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket, pulled out a thick, folded legal document, and tossed it across the table. It landed with a soft thud, directly on top of my plate, the edge of the thick parchment paper, soaking up a pool of brown gravy. I looked down at the bold black letters printed across the top. 3-day notice to vacate. A sharp, cruel giggle broke the silence. Cassidy covered her mouth with her manicured hand, her eyes sparkling with malicious delight. She looked at our father with absolute adoration. "You have overstayed your welcome, Penelope," my father said, his voice cold and flat. His blue eyes locked onto mine, devoid of any paternal warmth. "You have contributed nothing to this family. You refuse to live by my rules, yet you squat in the guest wing of my home like a parasite. I have a buyer interested in the estate, and I need the property cleared. You have exactly 72 hours to pack whatever junk you own and get off my land." Andre leaned back in his tufted dining chair, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. He adjusted his silk tie, taking on his most condescending courtroom tone. "Let us be completely objective here, Penelope," Andre said, looking at me with unfiltered pity. "In the real world, 34-year-old women without college degrees or husbands do not get to live rent-free in $4 million estates. You have had years to figure out a career path, but you chose to be lazy. You chose to answer phones for minimum wage." Andre reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek designer wallet. He extracted a crisp $500 bill and slid it across the polished mahogany table toward me. It stopped right next to the gravy-soaked eviction notice. "Take it," Andre said, his voice dripping with faux generosity. "I will write you a check right now. You can use it to rent a U-Haul truck and put down a deposit on a cheap studio apartment somewhere across town. Consider it a charitable donation from my junior partner's salary. After all I had to grind for my spot at Sterling and Partners. I know the value of hard work, something you clearly never learned." Cassidy chimed in, resting her hand proudly on her husband's arm. "Andre is being incredibly generous, Penny. You should thank him. Dad has let you freeload for a decade. It is time for you to grow up and face reality." They sat there, a united front of arrogance and entitlement. A father drowning in leveraged debt. A sister living a complete lie. A brother-in-law who thought his law degree gave him the right to step on my neck to elevate his own status. They thrived on my supposed misery. They expected me to crumble. They expected me to burst into tears, to beg my father for more time, to promise I would be a better, more compliant daughter. They wanted the satisfaction of watching the family scapegoat break down in front of them. I looked at the eviction notice resting in my food. I looked at the $500 sitting on the table. And then I did the absolute last thing any of them expected. I smiled. I picked up the eviction notice, carefully wiped the gravy off the corner with my linen napkin, and placed it neatly beside my water glass. I ignored the money completely. I picked up my fork, took a slow, deliberate bite of my turkey, and chewed quietly. The silence in the dining room grew thick and uncomfortable. The victorious grins on their faces began to falter. They were waiting for a meltdown that was never going to come. I swallowed my food, took a sip of my sparkling water, and finally looked directly into my father's eyes. My voice was perfectly calm, smooth, and entirely stripped of any emotion. "You are liquidating your physical assets to cover your margin calls," I stated plainly. The room went dead silent. My father's confident posture stiffened. He blinked clearly, caught off guard by the financial terminology coming out of my mouth. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the edge of the table. "Which means the Westfield Commercial Complex project is completely dead." Donovan's smug smile vanished instantly. A flash of pure panic crossed his features before he quickly masked it with anger. "What are you talking about?" He snapped, his voice suddenly defensive. "That project is the cornerstone of my current quarter." "No, it is not," I replied, my tone conversational and light. "That project has been stalled for exactly 6 months due to a catastrophic lack of funding. You failed to secure the bridge loan from your secondary lenders, and the general contractors walked off the construction site this past Tuesday because their invoices bounced. You are trying to sell this estate because you are bleeding cash and the bank is preparing to call in your loans." My father's face turned the color of wet ash. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white. Andre completely stopped swirling his scotch, his lawyer persona evaporating into pure confusion. Cassidy looked back and forth between her husband and her father, entirely lost, unable to comprehend the sudden chilling shift in the room's atmosphere. I picked up my wine glass and took a leisurely sip, holding my father's terrified gaze over the rim of the crystal. The question hung heavily in the suffocating dining room air. How could the family failure, the woman who supposedly answered phones for minimum wage, know the highly classified, deeply buried financial secrets of his supposedly bulletproof real estate empire? My father's silence was deafening. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the arrogant flush draining entirely from his cheeks. For 10 years he had controlled the narrative. He was the infallible titan of Connecticut real estate, and I was the unstable, ungrateful daughter. Now I had just casually dismantled his entire financial facade between bites of roasted turkey. Before Donovan could formulate a lie to save face, Andre slammed his crystal glass onto the table. The sharp crack of glass against mahogany shattered the tension in the room. Andre stood up to his full height, adjusting his expensive suit jacket. He could not stand seeing another man, especially his wealthy father-in-law, lose the upper hand. More importantly, Andre could not stand a woman challenging his authority. "You are playing a very dangerous game," Penelope Andre said, deploying his deep, booming courtroom voice. It was the voice he used to intimidate junior associates and opposing counsel. "I do not know what kind of cheap internet sleuthing you have been doing from your little call center cubicle, but making defamatory claims about Donovan Caldwell's business empire is grounds for a massive libel suit." I kept my eyes locked on Andre. Public records and bounced checks from furious contractors are not defamation, Andre. They are facts. Andre pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me. "You listen to me very carefully. You are not just dealing with an annoyed landlord anymore. You are dealing with Sterling and Partners. My firm has officially taken over this eviction case. I am representing Donovan pro bono because ridding this family of a toxic squatter is a personal favor I am more than happy to perform." He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a thick embossed business card and tossed it onto the table. It landed perfectly beside the gravy-stained eviction notice. "We are not just going to evict you," Andre continued, leaning over the table like a predator moving in for the kill. "If you force us to take this to a judge, I will personally subpoena your entire medical history, every therapy session, every psychiatric evaluation, every prescription you have filled since you were 24 years old." The air in the room grew instantly heavy. They were going for the throat. They were weaponizing my darkest chapter. "We both know you are not well, Penelope," Andre said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper of fake concern. "We all remember your 20s. We remember the severe anxiety. We remember the panic attacks that left you paralyzed on the floor. We remember the months you could not even leave your bedroom, let alone hold down a job or manage a bank account." Cassidy eagerly jumped into the fray, emboldened by her husband's aggressive tactics. She rested her chin in her hand, looking at me with wide, mock-sympathetic eyes. "It is for your own good, Penny. You are clearly having another episode right now, making up wild delusions about Dad losing his money. You are completely detached from reality. You need real help, maybe a facility." Andre nodded firmly. "Exactly. When I present your history of severe mental instability to the judge, this will not just be an eviction hearing. I will petition the court to have you declared legally and financially incompetent. I will request that Donovan be appointed as your permanent legal conservator. You will not even have the right to open a checking account without his signature. You will lose every ounce of autonomy you think you have. A decade ago, that threat would have destroyed me. 10 years ago, the mere mention of my anxiety would have sent me spiraling into a panic attack right there in the dining chair. They knew that. They relied on it. My family had always used my mental health as a leash to keep me compliant. They thought my anxiety made me weak. They had no idea that surviving that darkness was exactly what had forged my mind into solid iron. I did not break character. I did not flinch. I slowly reached out and picked up Andre's pristine business card. I ran my thumb over the raised silver lettering. Sterling and Partners. I looked up at Andre. He was waiting for my surrender. He was waiting for the tears. Sterling and Partners. I read aloud, my voice smooth and perfectly composed. A highly prestigious firm, Andre. You must be very proud to be a junior lawyer there. In fact, I hear congratulations are in order for the entire partnership. Andre frowned, the aggressive posture faltering for a fraction of a second. What are you talking about? The merger rumors, I said, setting the card back down on the table. Wall Street is buzzing. The whispers in the financial district say that Sterling and Partners is currently being targeted for a very aggressive acquisition by a private equity firm, a complete buyout. I assume a brilliant, indispensable junior lawyer like yourself is perfectly secure in the upcoming corporate restructuring. Usually, when private equity takes over a bloated law firm, the mid-level associates are the first ones purged to cut costs. But I am sure you have nothing to worry about. Andre went completely pale. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. The merger talks at his firm were highly classified. It was a closed-door secret restricted to the senior equity partners. There was absolutely zero public knowledge of any acquisition. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the alpha male bravado completely stripped away. How do you know about that? Andre demanded, his voice cracking. Who told you that? I stood up from the table, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt. I ignored his panic entirely. I looked down at my father, who was still gripping the edge of the table in silence. I will not be signing your eviction notice, Donovan. I will see you and your pro bono counsel in court. Without another word, I turned my back on the stunned silence of the dining room. I walked through the grand foyer, my heels clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble, and stepped out the heavy front doors into the freezing Connecticut night. The icy wind hit my face, but I had never felt warmer. As soon as I reached the safety of my car, I pulled my cell phone from my coat pocket. I scrolled through my encrypted contacts and hit dial. It rang exactly once before being answered. "Good evening, Ms. Caldwell," my wealth manager said, his voice crisp and professional. "Marcus," I said, staring back at the towering facade of the Briarwood estate. "The time for waiting is over. Activate the portfolio. I want Obsidian Financial to immediately acquire every single defaulted commercial loan tied to Donovan Caldwell, and find the hidden second mortgage on this estate. I want to own his entire life by Monday morning." Marcus did not hesitate. There was a brief pause on the line, the sound of rapid typing echoing through the receiver before his crisp voice returned. "Consider it done, Ms. Caldwell. I am pulling up Donovan Caldwell's corporate portfolio now. It is a disaster. He has overleveraged 5 commercial properties across the eastern seaboard, and his primary lender has already categorized the loans as non-performing. We can purchase the debt for pennies on the dollar through our distressed asset division." I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders. The biting November wind whipped across the expansive lawn of the Briarwood estate, chilling my skin, but my mind was running white-hot. "Buy it all, Marcus. I do not care about the discount. I want the commercial loans, the equipment leases for his construction company, and the deed to every patch of dirt he claims to own. I especially want the hidden second mortgage he took out on Briarwood. He used my sister's signature to secure it, and I want that paper in my private vault before the banks open on Monday." I paced the length of the icy driveway, my heels crunching against the frozen gravel. For a decade, my father had sold the world a story of unparalleled success. He hosted charity galas, drove imported cars, and belittled anyone who did not match his fabricated standard of wealth. He built an empire on smoke and mirrors, funding a lifestyle of pure arrogance while secretly drowning in debt. And for 10 years, he used my mental health as a convenient distraction, pointing at the broken daughter, so no one would look too closely at his failing ledger. Now he had forced my hand. He thought the eviction notice was a display of ultimate power. He did not realize he had just handed me the keys to his kingdom. Marcus rattled off a few more financial figures, confirming the rapid acquisition protocols Obsidian Financial would use to sweep up my father's debt overnight. "We operate quietly," Marcus assured me. "He will not even know his loans have changed hands until the foreclosure notices hit his desk." While Marcus spoke, my phone vibrated sharply against my ear. A text message notification popped up on the screen. It was an iMessage from Cassidy. I pulled the phone away from my ear, keeping Marcus on speaker, and opened the message. It was a video file 10 seconds long. I pressed play. The shaky vertical footage opened inside the guest suite I had occupied for the past few weeks. My sister was holding the camera, her high-pitched, mean-spirited giggles providing the soundtrack. The camera panned to show my father and Andre standing in front of my open closet. "Looks like the freeloader forgot to pack," my father barked in the video, his face flushed with triumph. He reached into the closet and grabbed a handful of my clothes, ripping the hangers violently from the rod. Andre stepped forward, his sleeves rolled up, eager to play the role of the devoted son-in-law. "Allow me, Donovan. Let us take out the trash." Andre grabbed my heavy wool winter coat, the one I had bought specifically for the brutal Connecticut winters, and marched toward the large bay window. The window was thrown wide open, letting the freezing air into the room. With a loud, arrogant grunt, Andre hurled my coat out the second-story window. My father followed suit, throwing a pile of my sweaters into the dark night. Cassidy panned the camera down to the driveway, capturing my belongings landing in the wet, dirty slush below. The video ended with Cassidy flipping the camera to her own face, smiling brightly. "Have fun in a motel, loser," she chimed before the screen went black. I stood in the driveway looking down at the pile of my clothes scattered across the frozen pavement just a few yards away from where I was standing. The wool coat was already soaking up the muddy water from a nearby puddle. Any normal person would have screamed. A younger version of me, the fragile 24-year-old they loved to torment, would have fallen to her knees in the snow, sobbing, begging them to stop. They sent that video expecting to trigger a panic attack. They wanted to break me. But I did not feel a single ounce of panic. I felt an overwhelming crystalline calm. The last shred of familial obligation I held onto vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating precision of a corporate executioner. "Are you still there, Ms. Caldwell?" Marcus asked over the speakerphone, his voice cutting through the silence of the winter night. "I am here, Marcus," I replied, my voice dangerously steady. I looked up at the second-story window where I could see the silhouettes of my father and brother-in-law moving around, no doubt celebrating their cruel little victory. "Did something happen?" he asked, picking up on the shift in my tone. "Do we need to contact local authorities regarding an illegal eviction or property damage?" I stepped over my ruined winter coat, ignoring the freezing slush seeping into my shoes. "No. The police are a temporary inconvenience. I want absolute destruction. I need you to shift focus for a moment, Marcus. I need you to pull the corporate filings for a law firm in downtown Hartford." I gave him the name. Sterling and Partners. Marcus typed rapidly. "Sterling and Partners. Mid-sized corporate firm. They have a solid regional reputation. But I am seeing flags in their recent quarterly filings. They are overextended on their commercial leases and heavily reliant on a revolving line of credit to make payroll. Why are we looking at a mid-tier law firm? Because my arrogant brother-in-law is a junior associate there," I explained, walking slowly toward my car. "He just threw my winter coat out of a window because he believes his job makes him invincible. He thinks he is untouchable because he hides behind a fancy desk and a law degree. I want to cure him of that delusion." I opened my car door and slid into the driver's seat, shutting out the biting wind. The heater roared to life, but it could not match the fire burning in my chest. "Sterling and Partners is currently negotiating a merger to save themselves from bankruptcy," I told Marcus, recalling the terrified look on Andre's face at the dinner table. "They are vulnerable. They are desperate for capital. I want Obsidian Financial to buy out their revolving credit line immediately. I want to hold the master lease on their office building." Marcus let out a low whistle. "A hostile takeover of a law firm's operational debt. That is incredibly aggressive, Ms. Caldwell. We will essentially become their shadow board of directors. We will have the leverage to dictate their internal restructuring." "That is exactly the point," I said, shifting the car into gear. "I want controlling leverage over the managing partners by Monday morning. I want the power to decide who stays and who goes. Andre thinks he can use his firm to crush me. Let us see how tough he acts when he realizes I am the one signing his paychecks." I backed out of the driveway, the headlights of my car sweeping across the pile of discarded clothes in the snow. I did not look back at the house. I had everything I needed in motion. By the time the sun rose on Monday, my family would wake up in a world entirely owned by the daughter they threw away. The bell above the glass door of the local coffee shop chimed cheerfully, cutting through the low hum of the Monday morning rush. The air inside smelled richly of roasted espresso beans and toasted pastries. I sat at a small scarred wooden table in the back corner, my laptop open in front of me. To anyone walking by, I looked like a typical remote worker wearing a simple cream-colored turtleneck and typing diligently on a spreadsheet. I was not just typing, I was watching my dashboard light up as Obsidian Financial executed the hostile takeovers I had authorized exactly 72 hours prior. A shadow fell over my screen. I did not need to look up to know who it was. The heavy scent of expensive overbearing cologne announced him before he even spoke. Andre pulled out the metal chair across from me and sat down without asking. He was dressed in a pristine charcoal pinstripe suit, his silk tie knotted in a perfect double Windsor. He placed his monogrammed leather briefcase on the table, pushing my coffee cup aside to make room for his ego. "Is this where the customer service magic happens?" Andre asked, flashing a condescending smile that showed off his unnaturally white veneers. He looked around the bustling cafe, his nose wrinkling slightly, as if the presence of working-class people offended him. "I suppose it beats freezing in the snow with the rest of your garbage." I slowly closed my laptop, folding my hands neatly on top of it. "What do you want, Andre?" He chuckled, unlatching his briefcase with a sharp click. "Let us skip the pleasantries, Penelope. We both know you are entirely out of options. You have no money, no home, and absolutely no leverage. But Donovan is a generous man. He is willing to offer you a clean break." Andre pulled a thick manila envelope from his briefcase and tossed it onto the table. It slid across the wood and stopped against my laptop. "Inside that envelope is a non-disclosure agreement and a cashier's check for $1,000. Andre stated, leaning back and crossing his arms. "In exchange for this generous parting gift, you are going to sign over your beneficiary rights to your late grandmother's estate, specifically her vintage Cartier jewelry collection." I stared at the envelope. The jewelry was the last untouched asset in the Caldwell family trust. My father had not been able to pawn it off because it required the signatures of both of his daughters to liquidate. He was so desperate for cash to cover his failing commercial loans that he had sent his attack dog's son-in-law to bully me into giving up my half of the inheritance for a pathetic $1,000. And if I refused to sign, I asked, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. Andre leaned forward, his elbows resting heavily on the table. The smugness drained from his face, replaced by a cold, aggressive legal threat. "If you refuse, Penelope, I will personally make sure you never recover. Sterling and Partners is retaining Donovan as a client pro bono. I will bury you in so much frivolous litigation you will spend the rest of your miserable life in courtrooms." I watched a barista steam milk across the room, letting the silence stretch. "I will file civil suits against you for property damage to the Briarwood estate," Andre continued, his voice dropping an octave to ensure the surrounding tables could not hear his extortion. "I will drag your credit score down so low you will not be able to rent a cardboard box in a back alley. And if you try to fight me, I will subpoena your entire medical history. Every therapy session, every psychiatric evaluation you had in your 20s when you were having your little mental breakdowns. I will have a judge declare you financially and legally incompetent, and I will hand complete conservatorship of your life over to your father." "You would weaponize my medical history just to impress Donovan?" I asked softly. Andre let out a harsh, arrogant laugh. "You have no idea how the real world works, do you? You grew up in a mansion with a silver spoon shoved in your mouth and you threw it all away to play the tragic rebel. You disgust me." He jabbed his index finger onto the table, his face flushing with sudden intense anger. "I did not grow up with your privilege. I grew up with nothing. I had to scrape and claw my way into a top-tier law school. I had to work twice as hard as everyone else to secure a spot at Sterling and Partners. I fought my way into the elite class, and I earned my place at Donovan Caldwell's table. I am building an empire with Cassidy, and I am absolutely not going to let a lazy, ungrateful dropout ruin my father-in-law's legacy. You are going to sign that document, take the $1,000, and disappear. He shoved a silver fountain pen across the table. It rolled until it hit my hand. Sign it, Penelope. Now. I did not pick up the pen. I did not look at the envelope. I reached for my ceramic coffee mug, brought it to my lips, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The coffee was lukewarm, but it tasted entirely victorious. I set the mug down, keeping my eyes locked on his. Andre was breathing heavily, his chest puffing out beneath his tailored suit, waiting for me to shatter. He was waiting for the frightened, anxious girl from 10 years ago to emerge and beg for mercy. Instead, I unclasped the small, understated leather portfolio sitting next to my laptop. I reached inside and pulled out a single crisp sheet of heavy cardstock. I slid the paper across the table. It stopped perfectly over the top of his non-disclosure agreement. Andre frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. He looked down at the paper. At the very top of the page, printed in sharp modern typography, was a logo, a solid black geometric diamond. Obsidian Financial. What is this? Andre muttered, his eyes scanning the dense legal text on the document. That is an internal corporate memo, Andre. I said, my voice smooth and lethal. It was generated exactly 14 minutes ago. If you check your work email, you will find a digital copy waiting in your inbox. Andre's eyes darted back and forth across the page. I watched the arrogant flush drain out of his cheeks, replaced by the same chalky, terrified pallor my father had worn at Thanksgiving dinner. As you so eloquently pointed out, I said, leaning forward slightly, you fought very hard for your position at Sterling and Partners. It is a mid-sized firm, but unfortunately, it has been struggling with massive operational debt for the last 3 quarters. The senior partners have been desperately trying to secure a merger to avoid total bankruptcy. Andre swallowed hard, his throat bobbing against his tight silk collar. His hands began to tremble as he read the second paragraph of the memo. I smiled, offering him a look of absolute icy pity. The merger fell through this morning. At 8 o'clock sharp, Obsidian Financial bought out your firm's entire revolving credit line. We also purchased the master lease to your office building. I watched his eyes reach the bottom of the page where a bold, undeniable signature rested on the authorization line. My signature, Penelope Caldwell, Chief Executive Officer. You do not sit at the table with the elite, Andre, I whispered, letting the reality of his total destruction wash over him. You sit at my table, and I am liquidating your firm by Friday. Andre stared at the heavy cardstock, his eyes tracking over the ink as if trying to physically erase the words. The ambient noise of the coffee shop, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clatter of ceramic mugs, the low hum of morning conversations all seemed to vanish, leaving only the sharp, ragged sound of his breathing. He read the second page of the memo, his hands trembling so violently the paper rattled against the scarred wood of the table. It was an internal directive addressed directly to the senior managing partners at Sterling and Partners, drafted by my acquisitions team. The mandate was completely uncompromising. Obsidian Financial, as the new primary stakeholder, was demanding an immediate 20% reduction in total staff. The directive specifically highlighted the immediate termination of junior partners flagged for ethical violations and financial irregularities. You cannot do this! Andre choked out his voice, a frantic, desperate hiss. He looked wildly around the cafe to see if anyone was watching his public execution, his perfectly curated image cracking at the seams. I am a junior partner. I have a flawless record. My billable hours are the highest in the entire department. You have absolutely no grounds to flag me for ethical violations. This is a bluff. It is wrongful termination. I will sue you for everything Obsidian Financial is worth. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my folded hands, completely unbothered by his hollow threats. I would not bring up billable hours if I were you, Andre. It is a very sensitive subject right now. I watched the vein in his neck pulse rapidly against his tight collar. Let us talk about the Peterson account. I continued smoothly, keeping my tone light and conversational. On October 12th, you billed them for 14 straight hours of contract review at your premium hourly rate. It is a terrible shame you were actually spending that entire afternoon at the Cartier boutique in Manhattan purchasing a diamond tennis bracelet for Cassidy. Andre froze. His mouth went completely dry. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. I did not stop. On November 3rd, you billed a corporate client for 22 consecutive hours of deposition prep. Strangely enough, you and my sister were staying at a luxury ski resort in Aspen that exact weekend. Shall I continue? I have the exact timestamps aligning your fraudulent billable hours with Cassidy's Instagram posts and your personal credit card receipts. You have been systematically overbilling your firm's largest clients for 2 years to fund your wife's shopping addiction and keep up the illusion that you actually belong in my father's tax bracket. You are a fraud, Andre, and you have just been caught. Andre opened his mouth to formulate a lie, but the sharp ping of an incoming email echoed from his phone, which sat face up on the table. We both looked down at the illuminated screen. The sender was Arthur Sterling, the senior managing partner. The subject line read, "Immediate termination of employment." I nodded toward his phone. "Go ahead. Read it." Andre picked up the device with a shaking hand. He swiped open the email, his eyes darting frantically across the screen. I knew exactly what it said because my chief operating officer had drafted the template. Effective immediately, Andre was stripped of his title, barred from the building, and informed that a full audit of his client billing history was being turned over to the State Bar Association. He was not just fired, he was about to be disbarred. Andre dropped the phone. It clattered loudly against the wooden table. He gripped the edge of his chair, his breathing turning rapid and shallow. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead, gleaming under the cafe lights. He tugged violently at his perfect silk tie, suddenly suffocating. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as the reality of his total ruination settled over him. The alpha male who had strutted into the coffee shop demanding my submission was gone, replaced by a terrified, broken man gasping for air. "You ruined me!" he wheezed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "You completely destroyed my life." I picked up my coffee cup, taking my time. "I merely exposed the rot, Andre. You destroyed yourself. Oh, and before you rush home to update your resume, there is one more piece of corporate housekeeping we need to discuss." Andre looked up at me, his eyes wide and terrified like a trapped animal. What else could there possibly be? He gasped, tears of panic threatening to spill over his lashes. I smiled warmly. Obsidian Financial does not just buy corporate debt. We also hold a vast portfolio of private student loans. In fact, we recently acquired the loan block containing the $150,000 you still owe for your law degree. As of 10 minutes ago, my firm is your primary creditor. According to the terms of your specific loan, losing your employment triggers an immediate default clause. I expect repayment in full by the end of the month. Andre broke entirely. The arrogant, untouchable corporate lawyer disintegrated into a pathetic, desperate mess right in the middle of the coffee shop. "Please, Penelope," he begged, leaning across the table, his voice a frantic, wet whisper. He reached out to grab my hand, but I pulled it away smoothly, disgusted by his touch. "Please, you cannot tell Cassidy about this. You know how she is. If she finds out I have no job and no money, she will leave me. She will file for divorce before the day is over. I will do anything you want. Just give me a grace period. Do not tell your sister. I am begging you." I looked at the man who had gleefully offered me $500 to rent a U-Haul truck and move into a slum. I looked at the man who had proudly threatened to drag my darkest mental health struggles into a public courtroom just to win my father's approval. I looked at the man who had gladly thrown my winter coats into the freezing slush. I stood up from the table, sliding my laptop into my leather bag. I looked down at him, my expression completely blank, devoid of any sympathy or mercy. "I promise absolutely nothing, Andre," I said, my voice cutting through his pathetic sobs. "Enjoy your coffee." I turned on my heel and walked out of the shop, leaving him drowning in a cold sweat, his entire fake empire burned to the ground. I stepped out of the coffee shop into the brisk winter air, the bell chiming one last time behind me. The cold felt invigorating. For the first time in my life, I was not running from my family's cruelty. I was orchestrating their downfall. 3 weeks passed in a blur of strategic acquisitions and aggressive legal maneuvering. The eviction notice my father had so proudly served me was finally escalating to a pre-trial mediation. It was a mandatory step in the state of Connecticut before a judge would hear the case. Donovan saw it as a mere formality, a chance to flex his expensive legal muscle and force me into submission. He had no idea he was walking into an execution. The conference room in downtown Hartford was a masterclass in sterile corporate intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls, a massive mahogany table, and stiff leather chairs designed to make you feel small. I sat on one side, my hands resting loosely in my lap. Beside me sat Elias Vance. Elias was Obsidian Financial's top-tier corporate litigator. He did not look the part. He wore a slightly rumpled tweed suit, wire-rimmed glasses, and carried a battered leather briefcase. He looked like an absent-minded professor. That was exactly why I hired him. The heavy glass door swung open and my father strode in. Donovan Caldwell wore a bespoke Italian suit that cost more than most people earned in a year. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his jaw set in a permanent sneer of superiority. He did not even look at me. Following closely behind him was Gideon Roth. Gideon was a notorious shark, a high-priced attack dog known for burying opponents in paperwork and destroying them psychologically. He slammed his platinum briefcase onto the table and sat down, fixing me with a predatory glare. "Let us make this quick," Gideon barked, skipping any pretense of a greeting. "My client is a busy man. We are here to resolve a simple squatter dispute. You have illegally occupied the Briarwood estate, refused lawful eviction, and caused undue emotional distress to the property owner." Elias adjusted his glasses, peering mildly across the table. "My client was a legal resident of the estate, Mr. Roth, not a squatter." Gideon waved a hand dismissively. "Call it whatever makes you feel better. The reality is that Penelope Caldwell is a freeloader who overstayed her welcome. However, Donovan is a forgiving father. He is willing to drop the eviction lawsuit and spare you the public humiliation of a trial." Gideon slid a bound document across the mahogany table. It stopped inches from my hands. "This is a standard settlement agreement," Gideon stated smoothly. "You sign a full release of all claims to the Caldwell Family Trust, including the Cartier jewelry collection. In exchange, my client will not pursue you for back rent or legal fees. You take your clothes, you leave the state, and you never contact the family again." A very generous offer for a grown woman who refuses to get a job. I stared at the document. It was the exact same extortion attempt Andre had tried in the coffee shop, only dressed up in fancier legal jargon. Andre conveniently was nowhere to be seen today. He was too busy fighting disbarment. "I am not signing anything," I said, pushing the document back across the table with one finger. "And I am certainly not surrendering my grandmother's jewelry to fund Donovan's failing empire." My father finally looked at me, his eyes narrowing into cold, hateful slits. "You always were a stubborn, ungrateful disappointment, Penelope. I am trying to save you from yourself. If you do not sign that paper, Gideon will make sure you leave this room with absolutely nothing but a mountain of debt." Gideon smiled, a sharp, unpleasant stretching of his lips. He popped open his platinum briefcase and extracted a thick red folder. He tossed it onto the table with a heavy thud. "If we go to trial," Gideon said, leaning forward aggressively, "we are amending the eviction suit to include severe property damage. Included in that folder are invoices, repair estimates, and photographic evidence detailing exactly $50,000 in damages to the guest suite of the Briarwood estate. Scratched antique hardwood floors, destroyed vintage wallpaper, broken fixtures." I felt a flicker of genuine shock. "You are fabricating damages." Cassidy and Andre threw my belongings out a window. "I never touched those fixtures." Gideon leaned closer, his voice dropping into a menacing hiss. "It does not matter what actually happened. It matters what I can prove in court. I have sworn affidavits from the estate staff and a highly respected contractor verifying the destruction. You are an unemployed dropout with a documented history of mental instability. Who do you think a judge will believe? Sign the settlement, Penelope. Because if you force my hand, I will press criminal charges for vandalism and destruction of property. You will go to jail." The room fell silent. My father leaned back in his chair, looking supremely satisfied. He thought he had me cornered. He thought he had found the perfect lever to crush me. Beside me, Elias Vance cleared his throat. It was a soft, polite sound. Elias slowly opened his battered leather briefcase. He did not pull out a defensive motion. He did not pull out counter affidavits. He completely ignored Gideon's fabricated folder of damages. Instead, he extracted a single slim file and placed it squarely in the center of the table. Mr. Caldwell Elias said, his voice mild and unassuming. Property damage to the guest suite is certainly a tragic loss. However, we have a much more pressing concern regarding the Briarwood estate. Donovan frowned, shifting uncomfortably in his leather chair. What are you talking about? Elias opened the file. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked directly at my father. I am looking at a series of wire transfers and loan originations from the 14th of last month. Can you explain why your signature is on a $2 million equity loan taken out against the Briarwood estate? Gideon scoffed, rolling his eyes. My client's financial decisions are entirely irrelevant to this eviction proceeding. You are grasping at straws, counselor. Actually, Elias continued, ignoring Gideon completely. The loan itself is not the issue. The issue is the routing. The $2 million was immediately transferred into a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, a corporation named Briar Holdings, LLC. All the color instantly vanished from Donovan's face. His arrogant sneer dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly, his knuckles turned stark white. You see, Donovan, I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany table. Briarwood is part of an irrevocable family trust. You cannot legally borrow against it without the signatures of all living beneficiaries. My signature is required, and I never signed anything. Donovan's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like he was suffocating. Gideon turned to his client, his aggressive demeanor faltering. Donovan, what are they talking about? I thought you said the estate was free and clear. My father could not look at his shark lawyer. His eyes were locked on the file in front of Elias. He was staring at it as if it were a loaded weapon. He had hidden those accounts behind layers of encrypted offshore shell companies. He had paid exorbitant fees to ensure they were untraceable. He had no earthly idea how my quiet, rumpled lawyer possessed an exact copy of his Cayman Islands banking records. That is bank fraud, Donovan, I stated, my voice echoing loudly in the silent, glass-walled room. $2 million of wire fraud secured by forged signatures and hidden in offshore accounts to evade domestic creditors. Obsidian Financial does not take kindly to fraudulent loans, especially when we just purchased the original mortgage on the Briarwood estate. Cassidy had been sitting quietly at the far end of the mahogany table, meticulously painting her nails, with a clear topcoat and ignoring the legal proceedings entirely. At the mention of wire fraud, the small glass bottle slipped from her fingers and tipped over, pooling clear liquid onto the polished wood. She did not even notice. What $2 million loan? Cassidy asked, her perfectly pitched voice wavering. Her gaze snapped from me to our father. Daddy, what is she talking about? What offshore accounts? Donovan jerked in his chair as if he had been physically struck. Shut your mouth, Cassidy. Gideon, pack up your briefcase. We are leaving immediately. This mediation is over. I would strongly advise against leaving, Mr. Caldwell Elias said, his tone as mild and pleasant as a Sunday school teacher. Running from a federal paper trail rarely improves the optics, and I believe Cassidy has a vested right to review these documents. After all, she is the primary guarantor on the debt. Cassidy let out a sharp, confused laugh. A guarantor. I am not a guarantor on anything. I have never taken out a loan in my life. Andre handles all of our finances. I reached across the table, picked up the slim file Elias had produced, and slid it directly down the center of the mahogany table. It glided smoothly, stopping right in front of my sister. Open it, Cassidy, I commanded. Turn to page 4 and look right below Donovan's signature. Tell me what you see. Donovan lunged forward, stretching his arms across the table, trying to snatch the file away. Do not look at that. It is fabricated garbage. They are trying to trick you. Gideon Roth, however, possessed the reflexes of a true legal shark. He slammed his hand down on the folder before Donovan could reach it. Gideon pulled the file toward himself, his eyes scanning the documents with brutal efficiency. The color drained from the lawyer's face. He looked at Donovan, then slid the open folder over to Cassidy. Cassidy stared down at the crisp white paper. Her perfectly manicured finger traced a line of blue ink at the bottom of the page. "That is my signature," she whispered, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "But I never signed this. I do not even know what Briar Holdings LLC is." "Think back to the 14th of last month, Cassidy," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "You were visiting Briarwood for Sunday brunch. Donovan asked you to come into his study. He handed you a thick stack of legal documents and told you they were routine tax authorizations for the family trust. He said it was just standard estate maintenance. He flipped to the signature pages, handed you a pen, and you signed exactly where he pointed. You did not read a single paragraph, did you?" Cassidy looked up, her eyes wide and terrified. "I trust my father. Why would I need to read them?" "Because your father is a desperate sinking man," I replied, enunciating every word. "His corporate credit is completely radioactive. No legitimate bank in the country will lend him another dime. So he needed a clean proxy. He needed someone with an immaculate financial history, a pristine credit score, and absolute blind loyalty. He used you, Cassidy. He leveraged your spotless financial standing to secure a $2 million loan, forged your consent as a co-signer, and funneled the cash offshore to hide it from his creditors." Tears welled up in Cassidy's eyes, threatening to spill over her designer mascara. "But Andre and I are closing on our new house next week. We are buying the property in Greenwich. The bank is running our final credit check tomorrow morning." I leaned back in my leather chair, offering her a smile that held absolutely zero warmth. "Andre no longer has a job, Cassidy. He was terminated this morning for gross ethical violations. And your credit score is currently anchored to a $2 million defaulted loan that is under active federal investigation. Your debt-to-income ratio is ruined. Your credit is obliterated. You cannot secure a mortgage for a cardboard box, let alone a mansion in Greenwich. You are financially ruined, and your beloved father is the one who handed you the match." Cassidy turned to Donovan, her chest heaving, the perfect illusion of her pampered life shattering into a million jagged pieces. "Daddy, tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not use my name." Donovan was sweating profusely. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles bone white. He refused to look at his golden child. "Sweetheart, you do not understand corporate finance. I was protecting the family assets. I was going to pay it back before anyone noticed. It was a temporary bridge loan." Gideon Roth stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He snapped his platinum briefcase shut with a sharp, angry crack. "You lied to me, Donovan. You sat in my office, looked me in the eye, and swore the chain of title on Briarwood was completely clean. You swore there were no secondary encumbrances." "Gideon, sit down." Donovan barked, panic making his voice crack. "I pay you a retainer to fix my problems, not to lecture me. You pay me to litigate, not to participate in federal wire fraud." Gideon snarled, grabbing his coat. "I am bound by the ethical rules of the bar. I cannot represent a client actively engaged in ongoing financial crimes. I am withdrawing as your counsel effective immediately. Expect my formal notice of withdrawal by messenger this afternoon." Gideon turned and marched out of the glass-walled conference room without another word, leaving Donovan entirely exposed. Donovan leaped out of his chair, his face flushed a deep, dangerous purple. He looked cornered, rabid, and entirely unhinged. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "This means nothing. I will hire a dozen lawyers. I will drag you through the courts until you are old and gray. We are taking this to trial." He grabbed Cassidy by the arm, his fingers digging harshly into her silk sleeve. "We are leaving right now." Cassidy shrieked, trying to pull her arm away. "Let go of me. You ruined my life. You forged my name. I want to talk to her lawyer. I need to know how to fix my credit." "We are leaving," Donovan roared, yanking her toward the heavy glass door. "You will not say another word to these people. You will do exactly as I say." I watched him drag his golden child out of the conference room, her sobs echoing down the marble hallway long after the door swung shut. The invincible Caldwell family was tearing itself apart from the inside out. I looked over at Elias, who was calmly placing the loan file back into his battered briefcase. We did not even need a judge. The trial was going to be an absolute slaughter. The echo of Donovan dragging my sobbing sister out of the mediation room faded, but the war was far from over. He had promised to drag me through the courts until I was old and gray, and true to his arrogant nature, he refused to back down. He managed to scramble and find a replacement attorney willing to look past the glaring ethical violations of his offshore banking, a sleazy litigator named Marcus Thorne, who specialized in aggressive familial disputes. 3 weeks later, we found ourselves sitting in the austere wood-paneled courtroom of the Hartford County Superior Court. The air was heavy with the scent of floor wax and stale tension. Donovan was sworn in and took the witness stand. He had dressed specifically for the occasion, trading his flashy, bespoke Italian suits for a subdued, conservative navy blazer. He looked like the picture of respectable, weary patriarchy. He folded his hands neatly in his lap, offering the judge a tight, sorrowful smile. When Thorne began the direct examination, Donovan launched into an Oscar-worthy performance. He did not yell. He did not sneer. He played the role of a devastated father who had exhausted every possible option to save his troubled daughter. "It breaks my heart to be sitting here today," Donovan testified, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. He looked down at his hands, shaking his head slowly. "Penelope is 34 years old. I have provided for her entirely. I gave her a roof over her head in the guest suite of the Briarwood estate. I paid for her living expenses, her car, her medical bills. I gave her every advantage a father could possibly give a child." Thorne paced in front of the jury box, his tone oozing with manufactured sympathy. "And how did your daughter repay this generosity, Mr. Caldwell?" Donovan sighed heavily, glancing briefly in my direction with a look of profound pity. "She refused to launch. She refused to seek gainful employment. She isolated herself in that suite, ordering packages online, living in a complete fantasy world. She has struggled with profound mental health issues in the past, and I tried to be accommodating. I truly did. But my financial resources are not infinite. I tried to speak with her reasonably about contributing to the household, but she became hostile and delusional. She actually believes she is somehow entitled to live rent-free on my property forever." I sat next to Elias at the defense table, keeping my face perfectly still. Donovan was weaponizing my past struggles, twisting the narrative to make my corporate discretion look like lazy isolation. He was painting me as a parasite so that his illegal eviction would look like an act of responsible tough love. I had no choice but to initiate eviction proceedings. Donovan continued wiping a non-existent tear from the corner of his eye. "It was the hardest decision of my life. But sometimes a parent must employ tough love to force a child to finally stand on their own 2 feet. I had to push her out of the nest so she could finally learn how to fly." The judge, an older man with stern features, actually nodded in sympathy. The narrative was working perfectly. Donovan was the long-suffering provider, and I was the spoiled, entitled squatter. To finalize this tragic but necessary legal action, Thorne announced, turning to the judge, "We would like to submit Exhibit A into evidence." Thorne approached the bench and handed a certified document to the clerk, who passed it up to the judge. He then handed a copy to Elias. "Mr. Caldwell," Thorne said, turning back to my father, "can you please identify this document for the court?" Donovan straightened his posture, his voice regaining a fraction of its usual arrogant boom. "That is the master deed to the Briarwood estate. It clearly shows that I am the sole rightful owner of the property. The house belongs entirely to me, and as the sole owner, I possess the absolute legal right to dictate who resides on the premises and to evict anyone who occupies the property against my wishes." "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," Thorne said, offering a smug smile toward our table. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge looked over his glasses at my lawyer. "Mr. Vance, do you have a cross-examination for this witness?" Elias Vance stood up slowly. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, buttoned his slightly rumpled tweed jacket, and picked up the copy of the deed Thorne had just provided. He did not carry a flashy briefcase to the podium. He just held that single piece of paper. He walked toward the witness box, with the slow, ambling gait of a man who had all the time in the world. Donovan braced himself, his jaw tightening. He expected Elias to bring up the offshore accounts. He expected a fight over the forged $2 million loan that had shattered his relationship with Cassidy just weeks prior. Donovan had spent a fortune preparing his new lawyer to block any questions regarding his corporate finances, claiming they were irrelevant to a simple residential eviction. Elias stopped a few feet from the witness stand. He looked at Donovan mildly, his expression entirely unthreatening. "Mr. Caldwell." Elias began, his voice polite and conversational. "You just testified under oath that this document proves you are the sole and absolute owner of the Briarwood estate. Is that correct?" "Yes," Donovan answered firmly, his chin jutting out. "That is my house. I bought it, I maintained it, and my name is on the deed." Elias nodded slowly, looking down at the paper in his hand. "It is indeed a very official-looking document. It has the county seals, the proper notarization, and your name is certainly printed right here at the top." Donovan smirked. "I am glad we agree. Now perhaps we can end this waste of the court's time and proceed with the eviction order." "Not quite yet," Elias murmured. He took a few steps closer to the stand and held the document out so Donovan could see it clearly. "Mr. Caldwell, my eyesight is not what it used to be. Could you do me a favor and read the date printed at the very top right corner of this certified deed? The date of issuance." Donovan frowned, annoyed by the mundane request. He leaned forward and squinted at the small black text. "It says October 14th, 2018. Elias lowered the paper. 2018. "Are you absolutely certain about that date, Mr. Caldwell?" Donovan let out an exasperated sigh, looking at the judge as if asking for relief from this incompetence. "Yes, I am certain. That is when the county issued this specific certified copy for my personal records. The date is entirely irrelevant to my ownership of the property." Elias pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "Oh, I disagree, Mr. Caldwell. I believe the date is the only relevant thing in this entire courtroom today." Elias turned his back on my father and walked slowly back to our table. He reached into his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a fresh, unmarked manila folder. He turned back around, facing the judge. "Your Honor," Elias said, his voice suddenly losing its mild professorial tone. "The defense would like to submit Exhibit B into evidence. It is a fully certified, heavily authenticated legal document filed with the county clerk exactly 3 days ago." Thorne jumped to his feet, objecting loudly. "Your Honor, this is an ambush. We were not provided with this document during discovery." Elias did not miss a beat. "We were not required to provide it during discovery, Counselor, because the transaction did not legally conclude until 72 hours ago. It is a matter of public record as of this very morning." The judge frowned, waving Thorne down. "I will allow it. What is the document, Mr. Vance?" Elias walked up to the witness stand and handed the open folder directly to my father. "Mr. Caldwell," Elias said, his voice ringing with absolute crushing authority, "you are holding a deed dated 2018. But I want you to read the document I just handed you. Read it aloud to the court, Mr. Caldwell. Read the name of the new sole legal owner of the Briarwood estate." Elias let the revelation of the outdated 2018 deed hang in the heavy courtroom air. He watched calmly as Donovan's smug patriarchal facade cracked under the harsh fluorescent lights. The jury murmured, shifting their collective gaze from the newly submitted foreclosure documents back to the man sitting in the witness box. My father had just perjured himself, presenting a voided deed to claim ownership of an estate he had already lost to his own daughter. But Elias Vance was not finished. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and picked up a fresh stack of manila folders from our table. "Let us move past your deliberate misrepresentation of the Briarwood title. Mr. Caldwell," Elias said, his voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. "Let us examine the core of your testimony today. You sat before this judge and this jury, and you painted a very specific picture. You claimed you were a generous, exhausted father. You testified that my client is a delusional freeloader who drained your vast financial resources, forcing you to employ tough love. Is that an accurate summary of your sworn statement under direct examination? Donovan shifted his weight in the heavy oak chair. He tugged at the collar of his conservative navy blazer, sudden beads of sweat gathering at his temples. He shot a frantic glance at his new attorney, Marcus Thorne, but Thorne was too busy staring at the voided deed in horror to object. I am a provider, Donovan snapped, jutting his chin out in a desperate bid to reclaim his authority. I have supported my family my entire life. Penelope is an ungrateful child who refuses to understand the value of a dollar. She isolated herself in my home and contributed nothing. A wealthy provider, Elias corrected, mildly pacing in front of the jury box. You stated your resources were being drained by my client. Exactly how vast are these resources, Mr. Caldwell? What is your current liquid net worth? Thorne finally snapped out of his shock and leaped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. My client's total net worth has absolutely no bearing on this eviction proceeding. The plaintiff opened the door to his financial status the moment he weaponized it against my client. Elias countered smoothly, not even turning to look at Thorne. He testified that he was her sole financial lifeline and that her dependence was the catalyst for this lawsuit. I am merely testing the credibility of that specific claim. The judge, an older man with stern, deeply lined features, leaned forward. Overruled. The witness will answer the question. Donovan puffed out his chest. The attack on his pride was the only thing capable of overriding his legal self-preservation. He gripped the edges of the witness stand, leaning into the microphone, ready to perform. I am a titan of commercial real estate in this state, Donovan declared, his voice echoing loudly in the silent room. I own shopping centers, office parks, and luxury residential developments from Hartford to Greenwich. My portfolio is bulletproof. My personal net worth is comfortably over $20 million. A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. Donovan lifted his chin, soaking in the reaction. He was a man who lived and breathed his own mythology. He actually believed that if he said the number out loud with enough conviction, it would magically become true. I sat next to Elias, keeping my expression perfectly blank. I knew the truth. I knew what was inside the folders Elias was holding. I watched the man who had tormented me for 3 decades slowly realize he was trapped in a cage of his own making. $20 million, Elias repeated, tasting the words as if they were sour. A formidable sum, truly the mark of a titan. Let us take a closer look at that bulletproof portfolio, shall we? Elias dropped the thick stack of folders onto the evidence podium with a loud, heavy thud. The sound made my father flinch violently. I have here certified financial records, default notices, and final foreclosure warnings issued over the past 18 months. Elias said, his mild demeanor entirely gone, replaced by a razor-sharp legal precision. Let us start with the Caldwell Plaza in Stamford. According to these certified bank records, you have not made a single mortgage payment on that commercial property in 11 months. Is that correct? Donovan's face flushed a deep mottled red. The color crept up his neck, clashing violently with his white shirt collar. The retail sector is experiencing a temporary localized downturn, he stammered. It is a simple cash flow issue, standard business practice. And the luxury office park in New Haven, Elias pressed, pulling a sheet of paper from the top folder. The one you used as collateral to secure a high-interest business loan last year. The records show the primary lender initiated foreclosure proceedings 30 days ago due to chronic non-payment. Is that also standard business practice, Mr. Caldwell? I am restructuring that debt, Donovan shouted, his carefully cultivated image of the weary patriarch dissolving into pure aggressive panic. He pointed a shaking finger at Elias. You are twisting the facts to confuse the jury. Real estate is a game of leverage. You do not understand how these high-level corporate mechanics work. I understand basic arithmetic, Elias shot back, stepping closer to the witness stand. Let us look at the math. You owe $8 million on the Stamford property. You owe $6 million on the New Haven development. You have $2 million in unsecured high-interest business loans. You have a string of unpaid vendor invoices spanning 3 states and massive tax liens pending against your holding companies. Elias paused, letting the devastating list of failures echo in the silent courtroom. You do not have a net worth of $20 million, Mr. Caldwell. Elias stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. According to these certified banking records, your liabilities exceed your assets by a staggering margin. You are not a wealthy provider. You are $15 million in the red. You are functionally bankrupt. The courtroom descended into absolute chaos. The illusion of Donovan Caldwell, the untouchable real estate magnate, had been publicly slaughtered. He was not a father practicing tough love. He was a desperate drowning fraud who had tried to throw his daughter onto the street to maintain his crumbling facade. Donovan was sweating profusely. Thick beads rolled down his forehead, stinging his eyes. He looked frantically at Thorne, but his sleazy lawyer was staring down at the defense table, completely unable to stop the bleeding. Donovan let out a harsh, arrogant scoff. He adjusted his tie with trembling hands, forcing a condescending laugh as he attempted to claw back a single shred of his superiority. "This is absurd," Donovan sneered, looking directly at the judge. "This lawyer is trying to blind you with out-of-context paperwork. Yes, the market has been challenging. Yes, there are debts on the ledger, but I have personal relationships with my lenders. I am an institution in this community." He turned his glare back to Elias. "You think you have uncovered some grand conspiracy, Mr. Vance? You are an amateur. I sat down with the regional director of National Trust just last week. We had an expensive steak dinner, we shook hands, and they extended my grace period on all commercial mortgages for another 6 months. The bank and I have a mutual understanding. They know I am good for the money. I am completely secure." Elias Vance stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still, letting Donovan's arrogant declaration hang in the air. He ensured every person in the jury box, the gallery, and the judge's bench absorbed the sheer hubris of the statement. Then Elias adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked at my father with a gaze so cold it could have shattered glass. "Which bank, Mr. Caldwell?" Elias asked, his voice dropping to a deathly quiet whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "Because National Trust sold all of your commercial debt yesterday." The sharp crack of the judge's gavel cut through the stunned silence. Donovan sank back into the witness chair as if the bones in his legs had suddenly dissolved. His mouth hung slightly open, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. He had nothing left to say. The grand illusion was dead. "Your Honor," Thorne stammered frantically, shuffling the papers on his desk. "The plaintiff requests a brief recess to review these documents." "Denied," the judge stated flatly, his stern gaze fixed on my father. "The court will not pause for you to consult with your client regarding his own bank records. Do you have redirect for this witness, Mr. Thorne?" Thorne swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his tight collar. "No, Your Honor." The plaintiff calls Cassidy Caldwell to the stand. Donovan stepped down from the box, his movements stiff and robotic. He did not look at me. He did not look at the jury. He stared straight ahead at the polished mahogany doors at the back of the room. Cassidy stood up from the front row of the gallery. Normally, my sister treated any public appearance like a runway show. Today, she looked entirely diminished. She wore a pale pink cashmere dress that seemed to swallow her small frame. Her hands were shaking visibly as she walked past the defense table. She took the oath, her voice barely a whisper, and sat down in the wooden chair. She kept glancing toward the gallery. I followed her line of sight and saw Andre sitting in the second row. He wore a sharp gray suit, projecting the image of a successful attorney, but his knee was bouncing rapidly against the wooden pew in front of him. He looked like a man waiting for the floor to open up and swallow him whole. Thorne approached the witness box, desperately needing to steer the jury away from Donovan's catastrophic financial ruin. "Mrs. Caldwell," Thorne began, attempting a soothing, sympathetic tone. "We are here today to discuss the eviction of your sister Penelope. Can you describe her behavior during her time residing at the Briarwood estate?" Cassidy gripped the edges of the wooden witness box. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously around the room before settling on Thorne. "She is a menace," Cassidy recited, her voice trembling slightly. She was always screaming at the estate staff. She broke antique vases in the hallway. She deliberately scratched the hardwood floors in the guest suite just to spite our father. We were all terrified of her. She is completely unstable. Thorne nodded gravely, turning to face the jury to ensure they absorbed the rehearsed lines. "And did she contribute financially to the household?" "Never," Cassidy said, her voice gaining a fraction of its usual arrogant edge. "She just locked herself in her room and expected my father to pay for everything. She is a parasite. My father had to evict her for the safety and sanity of the entire family." "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell," Thorne said, walking back to his table with a triumphant nod. "No further questions." Elias Vance stood up. He did not bring any folders with him this time. He just walked to the center of the floor, his hands resting casually in the pockets of his tweed trousers. "Mrs. Caldwell," Elias said gently, "you have painted a very vivid picture of my client as a financial burden. Tell me, do you consider yourself financially independent?" Cassidy lifted her chin, her perfectly styled hair catching the courtroom lights. "Absolutely. I have my own household. I am married to a highly successful corporate attorney. We do not rely on my father for anything." Elias nodded thoughtfully. "A successful attorney. That would be Andre, correct? I understand you enjoy a rather comfortable lifestyle. You currently lease 2 vehicles, a Mercedes G-Wagon for yourself and a Mercedes S-Class for your husband. Is that accurate?" Thorne stood up. "Objection. Relevance. The witness's personal vehicles have nothing to do with this eviction. Goes to credibility, Your Honor," Elias replied without looking away from Cassidy. "The witness claims my client is a financial parasite while presenting herself as a paragon of independence. I am merely establishing the baseline of that independence." "Overruled," the judge said. "You may answer the question, Mrs. Caldwell." "Yes, we drive nice cars," Cassidy snapped, glaring at Elias. "We work hard. We deserve them." "You certainly have expensive tastes," Elias continued mildly. "According to public social media posts, you recently returned from a 10-day ski trip in Aspen. You frequently purchase designer handbags, specifically Hermes and Chanel. And I understand you are currently under contract to purchase a $5 million home in Greenwich." Cassidy smiled, a smug, self-satisfied expression returning to her face. "My husband provides very well for me. He is a senior associate at Sterling and Partners. He is on the partner track. We are closing on the Greenwich house next week." Elias pulled his hands out of his pockets. He walked back to our table, picked up a single manila folder, and approached the witness box. He handed the open folder to Cassidy. "Mrs. Caldwell, I would like you to review these documents. These are subpoenaed financial records for your personal and joint bank accounts. Could you please read the current balance on your Platinum American Express card?" Cassidy looked down at the paper. Her smug smile vanished instantly. She blinked rapidly, leaning closer to the document as if the numbers might magically rearrange themselves. "That cannot be right," Cassidy whispered. "Please read the number for the court," Mrs. Caldwell, Elias instructed firmly. "It says the balance is $85,000, Cassidy choked out, her face draining of all color. "But that is impossible. Andre pays that card off in full every single month." "Clearly he missed a payment," Elias noted dryly. "Or perhaps several. Now please turn to the second page. That is the ledger for your joint checking account. Can you point to the last payroll deposit from Sterling and Partners?" Cassidy frantically scanned the page, her perfectly manicured fingernail dragging down the column of numbers. "There is nothing here," she said, her voice rising in panic. "There has not been a deposit in 2 weeks. Where is his paycheck? Where is the money?" Elias leaned closer, his voice dropping into a tone of quiet devastation. "Your husband has not deposited a paycheck, Mrs. Caldwell, because he no longer has a job. He was terminated by Sterling and Partners for fraudulent billing. He is currently facing disbarment." The courtroom erupted into shocked whispers. Cassidy dropped the folder. The papers scattered across the floor of the witness box. She gripped the microphone, her breath coming in ragged, audible gasps. "That is a lie," Cassidy shrieked, looking wildly around the room. Andre goes to work every day. He leaves the house at 7 in the morning in his suit. He told me the Greenwich mortgage was fully approved yesterday. Your Greenwich mortgage was denied 3 days ago, Elias stated loudly, talking over her rising hysteria. It was denied because your husband has no income and because your personal credit score was obliterated when your father forged your signature on a $2 million offshore loan. You are completely broke, Mrs. Caldwell. Your credit cards are maxed out. Your cars are currently scheduled for repossession and your husband has been lying to your face every single morning. Cassidy froze. The absolute reality of her total destruction finally pierced through her manufactured bubble of privilege. She slowly turned her head, her wide, terrified eyes searching the gallery. She found Andre. He was standing up, edging his way toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes wide with the panicked guilt of a man who had just been caught in the ultimate lie. Andre Cassidy screamed, her voice cracking with pure agony. Andre did not answer. He shoved the wooden doors open and sprinted out into the hallway, leaving his wife sobbing uncontrollably on the witness stand. Her entire world burned to ash in front of a judge and jury. "Order in the court!" the judge bellowed, slamming his gavel down as the gallery erupted into frantic whispers. "We will take a 15-minute recess." Court is adjourned until 20 past the hour. Cassidy practically fell out of the witness box. She stumbled over the hem of her cashmere dress, completely ignoring the judge, her lawyer, and our father. She ran down the center aisle of the courtroom, pushing past the swinging wooden doors in desperate pursuit of her fleeing husband. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my blazer. Elias Vance calmly organized his manila folders, slipping them back into his battered leather briefcase. He offered me a small, knowing nod. We walked out of the courtroom together, stepping into the expansive marble hallway of the courthouse. It did not take long to find them. Andre was cornered near the bank of elevators. He was jabbing the down button repeatedly with a shaking finger, desperate to escape the building before his wife reached him. He was too late. Cassidy caught him by the shoulder and spun him around. Her face was streaked with mascara. Her perfect blowout ruined her eyes wide with a frantic, terrifying clarity. "Tell me it is a lie!" Cassidy shrieked, her voice echoing sharply against the vaulted ceilings. "Tell me that pathetic lawyer is lying. Where is your paycheck, Andre? What happened to our house in Greenwich?" Andre looked around the hallway. Clerks, paralegals, and opposing counsel were all stopping to watch the spectacle. He reached out, trying to grab her hands to quiet her down. "Cassidy, please." "Not here. Keep your voice down. We will talk about this at home." "We do not have a home," she screamed, swatting his hands away, as if they burned her. "Is it true? Did they fire you?" Andre's shoulders slumped. The last remaining shred of his arrogant corporate armor dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, broken man. He could not look her in the eye. He stared at the marble floor, his voice cracking. "Yes, they fired me. The State Bar Association is auditing all my client files." Cassidy gasped, taking a physical step backward. Her hands flew to her mouth. "You lied to me. You put on a suit every single morning and told me you were going to the office. I bought custom furniture for the Greenwich estate yesterday. I put $50,000 on my platinum card because you told me my limits were cleared." "How could I clear them?" Andre snapped, his own panic finally mutating into defensive rage. "I have not had a salary in weeks. You spend money faster than I can steal it, Cassidy. You buy Chanel bags and Aspen ski passes while I am drowning in debt trying to keep up with the Caldwell standard of living. The Greenwich house is gone. The deposit is gone. We have absolutely nothing left." Cassidy let out a guttural sob, dropping her face into her hands. The golden child, the woman who had spent her entire life looking down on me from her pedestal of inherited wealth and manufactured perfection, was publicly disintegrating. Before Andre could attempt to comfort her, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open violently. Donovan Caldwell stormed into the hallway, his face a mask of furious, unadulterated rage. Marcus Thorne trotted nervously behind him, looking like a whipped dog. Donovan marched directly up to Andre. He did not ask what was happening. He did not offer comfort to his sobbing daughter. He immediately sought a scapegoat to regain his own sense of power. "You pathetic, useless excuse for a man. Donovan hissed, getting right into Andre's face. "You bring this humiliation into a public courthouse. You allow my daughter to be humiliated on the stand. I gave you my blessing to marry her because you promised you could provide for her. You are a complete failure." Andre flinched, stepping back until his spine hit the elevator doors. Donovan pressed his advantage, his voice rising, drawing even more spectators in the hallway. "You have ruined my daughter's life," Donovan spat, pointing a thick finger at Andre's chest. "You are a fraud. A cheap, incompetent fraud. I will make sure you never work in this state again. I will bury you so deep you will never see daylight. You are nothing to this family anymore." For a moment, Andre looked like he was going to cry. He looked like the terrified coward who had begged me in the coffee shop not to expose him. But something shifted in his eyes. He looked at his sobbing wife, then at the arrogant, sneering face of his father-in-law. The sheer hypocrisy of Donovan Caldwell finally pushed Andre over the edge. "I ruined her life," Andre yelled, pushing Donovan's hand away with sudden explosive force. "You have no right to judge me. You are functionally bankrupt. You have defaulted on every single property you own." Donovan's face flushed purple. "Lower your voice, you insolent little boy." "No, I will not lower my voice," Andre roared, stepping forward, forcing Donovan to actually retreat a step. "You call me a fraud. You used your own daughter as a human shield. You were so desperate for cash, you forged Cassidy's signature on a $2 million loan to hide money offshore. You destroyed her credit. You guaranteed she will never get a mortgage again. I might have lost my job, Donovan, but you actively committed federal wire fraud. You sacrificed your own flesh and blood to save your sinking empire. You are the real parasite here." The silence in the hallway was absolute. The accusations hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Clerks were openly staring. A rival attorney from another firm pulled out his phone, likely texting everyone he knew about the implosion of the great Donovan Caldwell. Cassidy looked up from her hands, her mascara-stained eyes darting between her husband and her father. The realization washed over her. The two men she had trusted implicitly, the two men who had funded her lavish reality, had both betrayed her completely. She let out a small, broken whimper and slid down the marble wall, collapsing onto the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. Donovan looked around the hallway, realizing the magnitude of the public spectacle. His chest heaved as he fought to maintain his composure. He smoothed the lapels of his navy blazer, his eyes darting frantically, looking for a way to regain control. He turned his glare toward me. I was standing a few yards away, my arms crossed, watching his empire burn. He opened his mouth to hurl another threat, but the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open once more. The bailiff stepped out into the hallway, his face entirely devoid of emotion. "Court is back in session," the bailiff announced loudly. "All parties must return inside immediately." Donovan exhaled sharply. He looked down at Cassidy crying on the floor and Andre seething by the elevators. He completely abandoned them both. He turned his back on his broken family and marched toward the courtroom doors. "Get inside," Thorne Donovan snapped over his shoulder to his lawyer. "We are not done here. I still own the Briarwood estate. I am still going to evict that ungrateful squatter, and I am going to make sure she pays for every second of this embarrassment." He pushed past the bailiff, his chin held high, marching back into the courtroom entirely convinced he could still win the war. He had no idea Elias Vance had saved the absolute best piece of evidence for last. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind Donovan as he marched back to the plaintiff table. He ignored the frantic whispers rippling through the gallery. He ignored his weeping daughter in the hallway and his disgraced son-in-law fleeing the building. He smoothed the lapels of his navy blazer, sat down rigidly in his chair, and fixed his eyes entirely on me. Donovan was a cornered animal. His public image had just sustained a catastrophic fatal blow. His massive financial debts were now a matter of public record. His son-in-law had just exposed his offshore fraud to a room full of officers of the court. But Donovan Caldwell possessed a lethal, blinding arrogance. In his mind, he could still salvage his pride if he could just secure this one victory. He needed to watch the judge sign the eviction order. He needed to watch bailiffs physically remove me from the Briarwood estate. He needed to prove that despite everything else collapsing around him, he still held absolute power over his daughter. Judge Rosalind took her seat at the bench. She arranged her robes, her stern features set in a grim line after witnessing the spectacular familial implosion that had just spilled out into her hallway. She picked up her gavel and struck the sounding block once. "Court is back in session," Judge Rosalind announced, her voice echoing sharply in the cavernous room. "Mr. Thorne, does the plaintiff have any further testimony to offer before I rule on this eviction petition?" Marcus Thorne looked like he wanted to crawl under the plaintiff table and disappear. His suit was damp with nervous sweat. He stood up slowly, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges of his legal pad. "Your Honor, the plaintiff rests. We believe the original deed submitted into evidence clearly establishes Mr. Caldwell as the sole owner of the Briarwood estate. The defense's claims regarding commercial debt have no bearing on his legal right to evict a non-paying tenant from his personal residence." Donovan could not help himself. Thorne's weak delivery was not enough to satisfy his bruised ego. He stood up, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape, and addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, I am the victim here," Donovan declared, his booming voice filling the room with manufactured righteous indignation. "You have seen the circus my family has become. You have seen the disrespect I endure. I have given that girl everything. I sheltered her, I fed her, I put a roof over her head, while she sat in her room contributing absolutely nothing to society. She is a drain on my life and a menace to my household." He pointed a stiff accusatory finger at me. I sat perfectly still next to Elias, letting my father dig his own grave. "I own that estate," Donovan insisted, his face flushing with aggressive heat. "It is my property. I built it with my own 2 hands. Without me, she would be homeless. I am just trying to evict her so she learns a lesson. She needs to understand that she cannot leech off my hard work forever. I demand this court uphold my property rights and remove her immediately." Donovan sat back down, breathing heavily, his chest puffed out in defiance. He looked at me with a smug, venomous sneer, entirely convinced his impassioned speech had secured his victory. Judge Rosalind did not react to his outburst. She slowly turned her attention to our table. "Mr. Vance, do you have a final response to the plaintiff's petition?" Elias Vance stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not point fingers. He simply picked up the single manila folder he had presented right before the recess. "Your Honor," Elias said, his tone mild and conversational, "the defense has already submitted our final response. It is resting on your desk, marked as Defense Exhibit B. Mr. Caldwell claims he is trying to teach my client a lesson about property rights. I believe Exhibit B will serve as a profound educational experience for everyone in this room. I ask the court to review the certified transfer of deed for the Briarwood estate executed 72 hours ago." Judge Rosalind frowned slightly. She picked up the heavy notarized document from the top of her evidence stack. She adjusted her reading glasses and began to scan the first page. The courtroom fell into a suffocating, absolute silence. Everyone watched the judge's face. As she read, the stern, impassive lines of her face began to shift. Her eyebrows rose toward her hairline. She flipped to the second page, her eyes darting quickly across the dense legal text. She looked at the county clerk's seal, the final signatures, and the attached financial addendums. Judge Rosalind slowly lowered the document. She looked at Donovan, who was sitting tall and arrogant at his table. Then she looked at Marcus Thorne, who was visibly sweating. Finally, she looked directly at me. Her expression was a mixture of profound shock and deep, unspoken respect. She turned her gaze back to the plaintiff table. "So they really do not know?" Thorne furrowed his brow, leaning forward in confusion. "Know what?" Judge Rosalind looked at Donovan with absolute pity. "Actually, she is the CEO of Obsidian Financial. She owns the bank." Donovan stopped breathing. The color violently drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He stared at the judge, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, trying to force his brain to process the impossible words she had just spoken. Obsidian Financial was the ruthless, aggressive private equity firm that had been buying up distressed commercial real estate debt across the East Coast. They were the anonymous corporate giant that had purchased all of Donovan's toxic loans from National Trust yesterday morning. Elias Vance stepped out from behind our table, projecting his voice so every single person in the gallery could hear the final crushing truth. "Allow me to clarify the mechanics for the plaintiff, Your Honor," Elias announced clearly. "For the past 3 years, my client has not been isolating herself in her room ordering packages. She has been quietly building a massive, highly leveraged financial acquisition firm. When Mr. Caldwell defaulted on his Stamford Plaza, his New Haven development, and his unsecured business loans, National Trust packaged that toxic debt and sold it to the highest bidder." Elias turned to look directly at my father. "Obsidian Financial bought your entire portfolio for pennies on the dollar, Mr. Caldwell. You were wildly over-leveraged. Because you used the Briarwood estate as collateral to secure your failing commercial projects, Obsidian Financial exercised its legal right to execute an immediate expedited foreclosure on the residential property to satisfy your outstanding corporate debts." Donovan gripped the edge of his table. His knuckles turned stark white. A low, strangled wheeze escaped his throat. "The transaction cleared the county clerk's office 3 days ago." Elias continued, driving the final nail into the coffin. "My client, Penelope Caldwell, as the sole owner and chief executive officer of Obsidian Financial, foreclosed on the Briarwood estate. She holds the new absolute title to the property." Elias turned back to Judge Rosalind. "Therefore, Your Honor, the plaintiff cannot evict my client. You cannot evict the landlord. In fact, Mr. Caldwell is currently trespassing on property owned by Obsidian Financial. We respectfully request this eviction petition be dismissed with prejudice, and we ask the court to formally recognize the new ownership of the estate." Donovan Caldwell sat paralyzed in his chair. The titan of real estate had been completely dismantled. The daughter he had mocked as a lazy parasite, the child he had tried to throw onto the street, had methodically bought his debt, seized his assets, and purchased the very ground beneath his feet. He did not own the shopping centers. He did not own the luxury office parks. He did not own the mansion he had built with his own 2 hands. He looked across the courtroom at me. His arrogant sneer was completely gone. His patriarchal fury had evaporated. There was nothing left in his eyes but hollow, absolute terror. I looked back at the man who had tormented me for my entire life, keeping my expression perfectly calm, and offered him a single polite smile. The lesson had finally been taught. Donovan stared down at the manila folder. His thick fingers gripped the edges of the paper so tightly his knuckles turned stark white under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. He opened his mouth, but the words seemed to catch in his throat, choking on the reality of the ink printed on the page. "Read it, Mr. Caldwell." Elias repeated, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "Obsidian Financial LLC." Donovan finally spat out, practically throwing the document back onto the ledge of the witness stand, as if the paper itself had burned him. He turned his glare toward the judge, his face twisting into a mask of pure contempt. "Your Honor, this is an absolute farce. I have never heard of this company in my entire life. This is clearly some fraudulent shell corporation my daughter created to muddy the waters and delay these proceedings. It does not change the fact that I am a wealthy, respected developer and she is nothing but a squatter. My financial standing in this community is impeccable." I sat next to Elias at the defense table, keeping my face perfectly still. I watched the man who had tormented me for 3 decades puff out his chest, clinging desperately to the only thing he truly valued: his pride. He had spent his entire life crushing anyone who threatened his image, and he was fully prepared to lie under oath to maintain it. Elias Vance did not flinch. He simply picked up the document and slipped it back into his battered leather briefcase. "Impeccable financial standing." "That is a very bold claim to make under oath, Mr. Caldwell. You testified earlier during your direct examination that my client was draining your resources. You just told this court that you are a wealthy developer. For the record, exactly how vast are these resources? How much are you currently worth?" "Objection!" Thorne barked, leaping up from the plaintiff's table. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. "My client's overall net worth is entirely irrelevant to a simple residential eviction proceeding. The plaintiff opened the door when he explicitly claimed financial hardship caused by my client. Elias countered smoothly, not even turning to look at Thorne. He testified that his resources were finite and that her dependence was the catalyst for this lawsuit. I am merely verifying the credibility of that specific hardship. Overruled, the judge stated, his stern features set in a grim line as he waved Thorne down. The witness will answer the question. Donovan adjusted his conservative navy blazer, jutting his chin out in a desperate bid to reclaim his patriarchal authority. He wanted to project absolute power. He needed the room to believe the grand illusion. I am a titan of commercial real estate in this state. Donovan boomed, his voice regaining its usual arrogant resonance, filling the cavernous room. I own shopping centers, office parks, and luxury residential developments from Hartford to Greenwich. My portfolio is bulletproof. My personal net worth is easily over $20 million. A collective murmur rippled through the gallery. Donovan soaked it in, a smug, self-satisfied sneer pulling at the corners of his mouth. He actually believed his own mythology. He believed that if he said the number out loud with enough conviction, it would magically become true. Elias Vance nodded slowly, pacing in front of the jury box. $20 million, a formidable sum. Truly the mark of a titan. Let us take a closer look at that bulletproof portfolio, shall we? Elias walked back to our table and picked up a thick, heavily bound stack of papers. He carried them to the evidence podium and dropped them with a loud, heavy thud. The sound cracked like a gunshot, making my father flinch violently in the witness chair. I have here certified financial records, default notices, and final foreclosure warnings issued over the past 18 months, Elias said, his mild conversational demeanor vanishing entirely. He was replaced by a man operating with cold, surgical legal precision. Let us start with the Caldwell Plaza in Stamford. According to these certified bank records, you have not made a single mortgage payment on that commercial property in 11 months. Is that correct? Donovan's face flushed a deep mottled red. The color crept up his thick neck, clashing violently with his white shirt collar. The retail sector is experiencing a temporary localized downturn, he stammered, gripping the microphone. It is a simple cash flow issue, standard business practice. And the luxury office park in New Haven, Elias pressed, pulling a fresh sheet of paper from the stack. The one you used as collateral to secure a high-interest business loan last year. The records show the primary lender initiated foreclosure proceedings 30 days ago due to chronic non-payment. Is that also standard business practice, Mr. Caldwell? I am restructuring that debt, Donovan shouted. The polished facade was cracking, allowing pure aggressive panic to seep into his voice. He pointed a shaking finger at my lawyer. You are twisting the facts to confuse the jury. Real estate is a game of leverage. You do not understand how these high-level corporate mechanics work. I understand basic arithmetic. Elias shot back, closing the distance to the witness stand. Let us look at the math. You owe $8 million on the Stamford property. You owe $6 million on the New Haven development. You have $2 million in unsecured high-interest business loans. You have a string of unpaid vendor invoices spanning 3 states and massive tax liens pending against your holding companies. Elias paused, letting the devastating, undeniable list of failures echo in the silent courtroom. You do not have a net worth of $20 million, Mr. Caldwell, Elias stated, his voice ringing with absolute crushing finality. According to these certified banking notices, your liabilities exceed your assets by a staggering margin. You are not a wealthy provider. You are $15 million in the red. You are functionally bankrupt. The courtroom descended into absolute chaos. The grand illusion of Donovan Caldwell, the untouchable real estate magnate, had been publicly slaughtered. He was not a long-suffering father practicing tough love. He was a desperate, drowning fraud who had tried to throw his daughter onto the street to maintain his crumbling, pathetic facade. Donovan was sweating profusely. Thick beads rolled down his forehead, stinging his eyes. He looked frantically at Thorne, but his sleazy lawyer was staring down at the defense table in sheer horror, completely unable to stop the bleeding. Donovan let out a harsh, arrogant scoff, desperately attempting to claw back a single shred of his superiority. This is absurd, Donovan sneered, glaring down at Elias with venomous hatred. You are trying to blind this judge with out-of-context paperwork. Yes, the market has been challenging. Yes, there are debts on the ledger. But I have personal relationships with my lenders. I am an institution in this community. You think you have uncovered some grand conspiracy, Mr. Vance? You are an amateur. I sat down with the regional director of National Trust just last week. We had an expensive steak dinner, we shook hands, and they extended my grace period on all commercial mortgages for another 6 months. The bank and I have a mutual understanding. They know I am good for the money. I am completely secure. Elias Vance stood perfectly still, letting Donovan's arrogant, delusional declaration hang in the heavy air. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked at my father with a gaze so cold it could have frozen the blood in his veins. "Which bank, Mr. Caldwell?" Elias asked, his voice dropping to a deathly quiet whisper that somehow carried to every single corner of the room. "Because National Trust sold your debt yesterday." The silence in the courtroom stretched thick and suffocating. The gallery, previously buzzing with frantic whispers, had gone completely dead. Every eye was fixed on Donovan Caldwell. His chest heaved erratically beneath his tailored suit. He stared at the paperwork Elias Vance had deposited on the judge's bench, then slowly turned his gaze back to me. Gideon, the senior partner who had been sitting pale and silent next to the hyperventilating Marcus Thorne, finally snapped out of his shock. He scrambled to his feet, his heavy wooden chair tipping over backward with a loud clatter. "Your Honor, this is a calculated ambush," Gideon stammered, his polished legal veneer cracking under the pressure. "We demand an immediate recess to verify the authenticity of these documents. My client had no prior notice of this acquisition. The defense is utilizing corporate shell games to execute a fraudulent takeover of a residential property." Judge Rosalind did not even look up from the foreclosure deed. She adjusted her reading glasses and ran a manicured finger down the list of notarized signatures. "The transfer is fully certified by the county clerk counselor." Judge Rosalind stated, her voice slicing through Gideon's panic. "The banking seals are authentic. Obsidian Financial is the legal sole owner of the Briarwood estate. Your client's lack of awareness regarding who buys his bad debt on the open market is a personal failure, not a legal defense." I stood up. The sound of my heels on the hardwood floor echoed like a gavel strike in the quiet room. Elias handed me a single sheet of paper from his briefcase. I did not look at the judge. I did not look at Gideon or the reporters in the back row who were frantically typing on their phones. I looked Donovan dead in the eye. The man who had controlled my every breath, who had dictated my worth based on his financial ledgers, was suddenly shrinking in his chair. The titan of real estate looked small, old, and terrified. I walked to the center of the room. I held out the document to the court bailiff. "Please ensure the plaintiff receives this," I said. My voice was entirely steady. It carried the icy, unyielding authority that I had spent the last 5 years forging in ruthless boardrooms and hostile executive suites. The bailiff took the paper, walked over to the plaintiff's table, and placed it directly in front of Donovan. Donovan stared at it as if it were a live grenade. His hands shook too violently to pick it up. "10 years ago, I began letting the words fill the cavernous space you threw me out of the house in the middle of a torrential rainstorm. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and $20 in my pocket." Donovan flinched. He opened his mouth to argue, to fall back on his usual booming intimidation, but no sound came out. His throat worked uselessly. "You threw me out because I refused to marry a man 30 years my senior." I continued, stepping closer to his table, forcing him to look at the daughter he had tried to sell. "You wanted to trade your 18-year-old daughter to merge your portfolio with a rival firm. When I said no, you told me I was dead to you. You told me I would be on the streets within a week, begging to come back to the Caldwell empire." Gideon slammed his hands on the table. "Objection. Your Honor, this emotional grandstanding has no legal relevance to the current eviction proceedings." Overruled. Judge Rosalind snapped immediately, her eyes fixed intently on me. The plaintiff opened the door to family dynamics when he spent 20 minutes disparaging the defendant's character under oath. I will allow it. I did not even blink at the interruption. I kept my gaze locked entirely on Donovan. You told me I would be homeless, I said, dropping my voice to a lethal quiet register. You told me I would never survive without your money. But I did survive. I built Obsidian Financial from a rented desk in a basement office. I spent the last 5 years analyzing every toxic loan you took out, every desperate margin call you made, and every property you leveraged to maintain your pathetic illusion of wealth. Donovan swallowed hard. A single bead of sweat dripped from his chin onto the mahogany table. I did not destroy you, Donovan, I stated with cold, surgical precision. I simply bought the matches you used to burn your own empire to the ground. And today, I am formally serving you a 24-hour notice of eviction. Get out of my house. A collective gasp erupted from the gallery. You cannot do this, Donovan croaked, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. He finally grabbed the eviction notice, his eyes darting frantically over the bold print. This is my home. I built it. You cannot just kick me out onto the street like a stray dog. I require 90 days' notice. I have tenant rights. I know the law. Gideon jumped in, desperate to salvage any shred of dignity for his high-paying client. He is absolutely correct, Your Honor. Even in the event of a foreclosure, standard eviction protocols mandate a minimum 30 to 90-day grace period for the current occupants to vacate the premises. Serving a 24-hour emergency notice is highly illegal and retaliatory. Elias Vance casually leaned against our defense table, crossing his arms over his chest. Normally, counselor, you would be correct. However, standard eviction protocols apply to legitimate tenants. Elias gestured toward the thick stack of evidence resting on the judge's bench. If you turn to page 4 of the foreclosure addendum, Your Honor, you will see a certified report from the Stamford Police Department alongside sworn affidavits from 3 of Mr. Caldwell's former household staff members. Gideon frantically flipped through his own copies of the documents. Donovan looked at his lawyer in blind panic, the remaining blood draining from his face. Those affidavits, Elias explained calmly, confirm that Mr. Caldwell has been actively attempting to illegally dismantle and sell off the property's fixtures. He has been quietly ripping out custom chandeliers, imported marble countertops, and historical architectural elements. He has been stripping the estate to secretly pawn the physical assets and hide the cash in offshore accounts to avoid his creditors. Donovan gripped the table, his chest heaving. They are lying. They are disgruntled employees looking for a quick payout. They provided photographs and pawn receipts, Mr. Caldwell, Elias countered effortlessly. You have been actively destroying the structural integrity of a residential property that was serving as collateral for a federal bank loan. Under state property law, if an occupant is actively causing malicious physical destruction to a foreclosed asset, the new legal owner is fully entitled to execute an emergency 24-hour eviction to preserve the estate. Judge Rosalind reviewed the page Elias had referenced. She nodded slowly, her expression hardening into absolute disgust as she read the police report. The paperwork is ironclad, counselor, the judge said, looking directly at Gideon. The emergency eviction is entirely lawful and justified. Your client has been caught actively stripping a foreclosed asset. Gideon slowly lowered the paper. He looked at Donovan, who was staring up at him with wide, pleading eyes. Gideon slowly took a physical step back, distancing himself from his client. He realized the battle was definitively lost. There was no money left to pay his exorbitant legal fees, and associating any further with Donovan Caldwell was professional suicide. Your Honor, Gideon said, quietly snapping his briefcase shut. We have no further objections. Wait, where are you going? Donovan hissed, grabbing Gideon's sleeve with a shaking hand. You cannot leave me here. Do your job. Stop them. Gideon pulled his arm away, forcefully smoothing his suit jacket. My job is over, Donovan. You are completely bankrupt, and you are facing federal fraud charges for those offshore accounts. I strongly suggest you spend your last 24 hours packing your bags instead of yelling at me. Gideon turned and walked briskly out of the courtroom, leaving Donovan entirely alone at the plaintiff's table. Judge Rosalind picked up her wooden gavel. This court formally recognizes Obsidian Financial LLC as the legal and sole owner of the Briarwood estate. The emergency eviction notice is upheld. Mr. Caldwell, you have exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises or you will be physically removed by county sheriffs. Case dismissed. The gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack. It was the exact sound of an empire collapsing. Donovan sat frozen in his chair. The crushing weight of reality finally fell on his shoulders. The luxury cars, the country club memberships, the sprawling mansion, the illusion of infinite power he had wielded like a weapon, it was all gone. He had absolutely nothing. He was officially homeless. I turned away from him, picked up my purse, and walked out of the courtroom, with my head held high, leaving the man who threw me into the rain to finally drown in his own storm. How are you feeling after such an intense courtroom scene? He had no idea Elias Vance had saved the absolute best piece of evidence for last. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut, sealing out the chaotic echoes of Cassidy weeping in the marble hallway. Donovan Caldwell marched down the center aisle with the rigid, aggressive posture of a conquering general. He completely ignored the frantic, whispering gallery. He ignored the empty space at the plaintiff table where his disgraced son-in-law should have been sitting. Donovan smoothed the lapels of his tailored navy blazer, shot his cuffs, and lowered his massive frame into his leather chair. Gideon, his senior legal counsel, looked far less confident. The seasoned attorney wiped a bead of sweat from his temple, his eyes darting nervously toward our defense table. Gideon could sense that the tectonic plates of this trial had shifted dramatically, but Donovan was entirely blinded by his own towering ego. In my father's mind, he was still the untouchable titan of local real estate. He believed that if he simply spoke loudly enough and commanded the room with enough aggression, reality would bend to his will. I sat perfectly still next to Elias Vance. I did not fidget. I did not look away. I kept my hands folded neatly on the polished wood of the defense table, watching the man who had tormented me for my entire life prepare to dig his own grave. Judge Rosalind took her seat at the elevated bench. Her stern, angular features were set in a grim line of judicial exhaustion. She had just witnessed a spectacular, humiliating family implosion spill out into her courthouse hallway, and her patience was completely non-existent. She picked up her wooden gavel and struck the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack that instantly silenced the murmuring gallery. "Court is back in session," Judge Rosalind announced, her voice cutting through the heavy air. "We are here to conclude the plaintiff's petition for an emergency residential eviction. Mr. Caldwell, does your counsel have any final legal arguments to present before I issue my ruling on this matter?" Gideon opened his mouth and reached for his legal pad, but Donovan brutally waved him down. My father pushed his chair back with a loud, abrasive scrape against the floorboards and stood up to his full, intimidating height. He did not want his lawyer to speak for him. Donovan needed to perform. He needed to reassert his patriarchal dominance and publicly humiliate me one final time. "Your Honor, I do not need my attorney to explain the basic principles of property rights," Donovan boomed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger directly at me. "I am the victim in this courtroom. You have seen the circus my ungrateful family has become today. I am surrounded by leeches and failures. But that girl sitting right there is the worst of them all." I did not blink. I met his furious glare with a cold, hollow stare. "I gave her everything," Donovan declared, puffing his chest out, completely wrapped in his manufactured, righteous indignation. "I sheltered her. I put food on her plate. I provided a roof over her head in my own personal estate, while she contributed absolutely nothing to society. She is a drain on my resources and a complete menace to my household. I own the Briarwood estate. It is my property. I built my empire with my own two hands, and I will not allow a lazy, incompetent squatter to occupy my home." Donovan took a deep breath, his face flushing with aggressive heat, as he delivered his final arrogant plea to the judge. "Without me, she would be homeless. I am just trying to evict her so she learns a lesson. She needs to understand the harsh realities of the real world. I demand this court uphold my legal property rights and order the bailiffs to remove her from my estate immediately." Donovan sat back down heavily. He shot me a venomous, triumphant sneer entirely convinced his impassioned, forceful speech had secured his victory. He believed he had just successfully painted himself as a benevolent, long-suffering father, dispensing necessary tough love. Judge Rosalind did not look impressed. She did not offer a sympathetic nod. She simply turned her sharp gaze toward our table. "Mr. Vance, do you have a response to the plaintiff's final statement?" Elias Vance stood up slowly. He did not raise his voice. He did not point fingers or engage in emotional grandstanding. He simply picked up a single manila folder from his briefcase and held it out. "Your Honor," Elias said, his tone mild and conversational, completely contrasting with Donovan's bombastic delivery. "The defense does not need to offer a verbal response. We respectfully direct the court's attention to the final document we submitted into evidence just before the recess. It is resting on the top of your bench marked as Defense Exhibit F. I believe this document will provide a profound educational experience regarding property rights for everyone in this room." Judge Rosalind frowned slightly. She reached forward and picked up the heavy, notarized stack of papers Elias had referenced. She adjusted her reading glasses and began to scan the first page. The silence in the courtroom grew thick and suffocating. Everyone watched the judge's face. Gideon leaned forward, his brow furrowed in deep, anxious confusion. Donovan crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw set in stubborn defiance. As Judge Rosalind read the dense legal text, the stern, impassive lines of her face began to shift entirely. Her eyebrows rose toward her hairline. She flipped to the second page, her eyes darting quickly across the corporate filings, the acquisition papers, and the certified financial seals. She read the county clerk's stamp of approval. She looked at the final signatures. Slowly, Judge Rosalind lowered the document. She took off her reading glasses and let them drop onto the bench. She looked at Donovan, who was sitting tall and arrogant at his table. Then she looked at Gideon, who was visibly sweating. Finally, she turned her gaze directly to me. The judge's expression was a mixture of profound shock and deep, unspoken respect. She shook her head in disbelief, looking back at the plaintiff's table. "So they really do not know," Judge Rosalind said, her voice echoing in the dead quiet of the room. Gideon frowned, his professional composure cracking as raw panic flooded his system. He stood up, his hands gripping the edge of his table. "Know what, Your Honor?" Judge Rosalind did not look at the lawyer. She looked directly at Donovan Caldwell. Her eyes held no judicial anger, only absolute, devastating pity. Actually, Judge Rosalind stated clearly, her words acting as a fatal blow to the Caldwell empire. She is the CEO of Obsidian Financial. She owns the bank. Donovan Caldwell's jaw went slack. The absolute certainty that had anchored his entire existence shattered in an instant. He stared at Elias Vance as if the lawyer had just spoken a foreign language. Elias did not give my father a single second to recover. He reached back into his battered leather briefcase and produced a second manila folder, this one marked with a bright red tab. He stepped forward and handed it up to the judge's bench. "Your Honor," Elias said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "While we have established that the Briarwood estate is now the legal property of Obsidian Financial, the forensic financial audit my client conducted during the corporate acquisition process uncovered a severe irregularity. It is an irregularity that requires the immediate attention of this court. Inside that red folder is a $2 million commercial loan agreement, ostensibly taken out by Mr. Caldwell's primary holding company exactly 6 months ago." Judge Rosalind opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the top document, her stern frown deepening into a mask of pure judicial fury with every line she read. She looked down at Donovan, completely stripping away whatever lingering respect the court might have held for him. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register, "this loan lists the Briarwood estate as secondary collateral. However, the primary guarantor listed on this document is Cassidy Caldwell. The signature at the bottom of this financial guarantee belongs to your daughter." Donovan's face flushed a dangerous mottled purple. He gripped the edges of the plaintiff table, his knuckles turning white as he desperately tried to maintain his crumbling facade. "That is an internal family financial matter," Donovan stammered, his booming voice reduced to a defensive bark. My daughter serves as a silent partner in several of my corporate LLCs. I handle all the complex paperwork on her behalf to protect her interests. It is standard operating procedure for a wealthy family trust. Elias turned sharply toward the gallery. I saw Cassidy sitting in the second row. She looked entirely exhausted, her posture slumped after watching her husband publicly admit to losing his job. But at the explicit mention of her name and a $2 million loan, her head snapped up. Is that standard procedure? Elias asked, looking directly at my sister. To leverage your daughter's personal credit to secure a high-risk offshore commercial loan without her knowledge. Judge Roslyn banged her gavel once, silencing the sudden murmurs erupting from the gallery. She turned her intense, scrutinizing focus directly on my sister. Miss Caldwell, please stand up. Cassidy slowly rose from the wooden bench. Her hands were shaking violently. She looked at our father, who was glaring at her with a desperate, threatening look, silently commanding her to play along and protect the family image. But Cassidy had already watched her husband admit to losing everything. The grand illusion of the Caldwell empire was dead. Miss Caldwell, Judge Rosalind asked clearly, ensuring the court reporter captured every word. Did you formally authorize your father to place a $2 million lien against your name and personal credit 6 months ago? Cassidy looked at the heavily stamped document resting in the judge's hand. She looked at Donovan, who was practically vibrating with rage at the plaintiff table. Then the horrific reality of her ruined financial future finally hit her. She had $50,000 in credit card debt, a husband under federal audit, and a father who had secretly sold her future to save himself. No! Cassidy screamed, her voice echoing wildly across the open court. No! I never signed that document. I do not even know what an LLC is. He told me he was clearing my credit limits so I could buy the new custom furniture for my house. He lied to me. He forged my signature. Judge Rosalind's face hardened into stone. She looked down at Donovan, who was now visibly shrinking in his chair, completely trapped by his own hubris. Mr. Caldwell, the judge said, her tone laced with absolute disgust. This court is no longer dealing with a simple residential eviction or a standard property foreclosure. Forging a signature to secure a multi-million-dollar commercial loan across state lines is wire fraud. It is a severe federal offense. Donovan tried to speak, but no words came out. He opened and closed his mouth, resembling a suffocating fish on a dry dock. Judge Rosalind turned abruptly to the court stenographer. Madam Clerk, I want the full transcripts of today's proceedings along with Defense Exhibits B and F, sealed and forwarded immediately to the District Attorney's Office for federal review. Donovan let out a strangled, breathless wheeze. The man who had confidently swaggered into the courtroom, expecting to throw me out onto the street, was now staring directly down the barrel of a lengthy federal prison sentence. This petition for eviction is dismissed with prejudice, Judge Rosalind declared, raising her wooden gavel high above the sounding block. Mr. Caldwell, I strongly suggest you retain criminal counsel before the sun goes down. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck the block with a final echoing crack. The gallery erupted into absolute pandemonium. Reporters scrambled over each other, rushing for the heavy double doors to break the spectacular story of Donovan Caldwell's complete downfall. I stood up slowly from the defense table, calmly smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. Elias packed his folders into his briefcase, offering me a tight, satisfied nod. I walked away from the defense table and pushed through the swinging wooden doors, stepping out into the expansive marble hallway of the courthouse. The air was thick with frantic, chaotic energy, but the moment I emerged, the crowd instinctively parted for me. The power dynamic had entirely inverted. I was no longer the pathetic outcast daughter they could mock. I was the CEO of Obsidian Financial. I was the woman who owned the very ground they walked on. Before I could even reach the bank of elevators, a figure darted out from behind a marble pillar. It was Andre. He had not fled the building after his public humiliation. He had been waiting for me in the shadows. His designer suit was heavily rumpled. His silk tie was loosened, and his arrogant corporate armor had completely dissolved into pathetic, shivering desperation. "Penelope, wait!" Andre gasped, practically throwing his body in front of my path to block my exit. "Please, just give me 2 minutes. You have to listen to me. I stopped looking at my disgraced brother-in-law with cold clinical detachment. Elias stepped up beside me, ready to physically intervene, but I held up a hand to stop him. You have exactly 1 minute, Andre, I said, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. Andre swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously around the crowded hallway. He was sweating profusely. Look, I know I was incredibly harsh before. I was under a massive amount of pressure. But you are the CEO of Obsidian Financial. You own the bank. You have the absolute power to fix this. My law firm is auditing me because of your father's toxic accounts. If you just call them, if you just vouch for my character, or transition the Obsidian legal accounts to my desk, they will reinstate me today. You know I am a brilliant lawyer. I can work for your firm. I will do whatever you want. I stared at him, letting the sheer, unadulterated audacity of his request hang heavy in the air. You want me to employ the man who spent the last 3 years calling me a parasite to my face. Andre wiped his wet forehead frantically. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a desperate whining pitch. He was completely willing to abandon his family to save his own skin. It was not my fault, Penelope, Andre pleaded, shaking his head rapidly. It was Cassidy. She forced me into this. She demanded the massive Greenwich estate. She demanded the Chanel bags and the luxury sports cars. She spends money faster than any human being can legally process it. She is a financial black hole. She forced me to cut corners and hide your father's fraud just to keep up with her insane, impossible standard of living. I am a victim of her greed. I had to do it to survive her demands. Andre was so focused on begging for his professional life that he did not notice the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swing open behind him. He did not see Cassidy step out into the hallway. Her face was pale, her makeup was ruined, and her eyes were burning with a fresh, violent fury. She had heard every single word her husband had just spoken. Cassidy marched across the marble floor. She did not scream. She did not cry. She walked directly up behind Andre, grabbed the shoulder of his expensive suit, and spun him around to face her. Before Andre could even register her presence, Cassidy swung her arm back and slapped him across the face with absolutely everything she had. The sound of the slap cracked like a whip, echoing sharply down the vaulted marble hallway. Andre stumbled backward, crying out in pain and clutching his rapidly reddening cheek in pure shock. Bystanders gasped instantly, pulling out their phones to record the violent public disintegration of the Caldwell marriage. You cowardly, pathetic little worm, Cassidy hissed, her voice shaking with absolute unfiltered disgust. You blame me for your crimes. You lied to me for months. You let my father ruin my credit and steal my future, and now you are begging my sister for a job while throwing me under the bus in a public courthouse. We are completely finished, Andre. I am filing for divorce today. Andre stood paralyzed, trapped between the furious wife he had just betrayed and the powerful sister-in-law he had spent years abusing. He looked back at me, his eyes wide and pleading desperately, hoping for a final lifeline. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I looked at the chaotic, miserable spectacle of my family destroying each other in the hallway. They were entirely consumed by the toxic greed they had worshipped their entire lives, and they were finally paying the price. I stepped around Andre, completely ignoring his outstretched, shaking hand. I stepped past Cassidy, who was glaring at her husband with undisguised loathing. I walked purposefully toward the bank of elevators, pulling my phone from my blazer pocket. I dialed the direct number for my head of private security. The line connected immediately. Send the tactical detail to the Briarwood estate, I commanded, my voice carrying clearly over the frantic noise of the hallway. Secure the entire perimeter and change every single lock on the property. We are executing a full repossession tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock. If anyone named Caldwell is still inside that house when you arrive, you have my full authorization to physically remove them. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, stepped into the waiting elevator, and watched the metal doors slide shut on my former family. Exactly 24 hours later, my driver turned the wheel of my sleek black SUV, navigating onto the long, winding driveway of the Briarwood estate. 2 local sheriff cruisers drove ahead of us, their blue and red lights flashing silently in the crisp morning air. Behind my vehicle, a convoy of heavy-moving trucks bearing the sharp obsidian black logo of my firm followed closely in a synchronized line. The towering wrought iron gates, which had once been locked to keep me out in the freezing rain, were now firmly propped open by the deputies. The loud crunch of heavy tires rolling over the imported gravel sounded like a steady drumroll announcing the final devastating act of the Caldwell Empire. I stepped out of the SUV and buttoned my tailored coat. The scene unfolding on the pristine manicured lawn was a masterpiece of absolute degrading panic. The grand mahogany front doors of the mansion were thrown wide open. Inside the vaulted marble foyer, the illusion of untouchable wealth had completely dissolved into frantic desperation. Donovan and Cassidy were sprinting back and forth across the foyer like trapped animals. They were not carefully packing their belongings into luxury leather trunks. They were frantically shoving armfuls of designer dresses, loose jewelry, and whatever silver they could snatch from the dining room into cheap black plastic garbage bags. I stood by the hood of my vehicle and watched Cassidy drag a bulging, tearing garbage bag full of custom shoes down the front steps. Her hair was a tangled mess. She was wearing sweatpants and a stained designer hoodie, a far cry from the polished, arrogant heiress who had sneered at me in the courtroom yesterday. She was crying hysterically, tripping over the heavy plastic bag as she tried to haul it toward the edge of the property line. Before Cassidy could even reach the driveway, the deep guttural roar of a diesel engine echoed through the estate. A heavy-duty commercial tow truck backed aggressively up the driveway, bypassing the sheriff cruisers and heading straight for the massive four-car garage. Cassidy dropped her garbage bag. Her eyes went wide with fresh horror as two men in high-visibility vests jumped out of the truck and immediately began hooking thick steel chains to the front axle of her pristine custom white Mercedes. "Stop!" Cassidy shrieked, her voice cracking as she sprinted across the gravel. "Get your hands off my car. You cannot take my vehicle. Do you have any idea who I am?" The lead repossession agent did not even flinch. He casually pulled a clipboard from his jacket and held it up to block her flailing hands. "I do not care who you are, lady," the agent said, his voice dripping with blue-collar indifference. "I care that the primary leaseholder, Andre Vance, stopped making payments on this vehicle 4 months ago. The bank called the note this morning. The car belongs to the dealership now. Step back or I will have the sheriffs arrest you for interfering with a lawful repossession." Cassidy froze. The reality of her husband's absolute financial betrayal washed over her. Andre had not just hidden her father's toxic debt. He had completely drained their personal accounts to cover his tracks, leaving her with absolutely nothing. Cassidy sank to the ground right there on the driveway, wrapping her arms around her knees and sobbing uncontrollably as the tow truck hoisted her ultimate status symbol into the air and hauled it away. While Cassidy wept on the gravel, the lead sheriff walked purposefully up the grand stone steps of the estate. He pulled a heavy staple gun from his belt and physically tacked the bright yellow notice of eviction directly onto the center of the custom mahogany front door. "Mr. Caldwell," the sheriff announced, his voice booming over the property, "this estate is now under the legal possession of Obsidian Financial. You have exactly 10 minutes to clear the property boundary with whatever you can carry. After 10 minutes, my deputies will physically escort you off the premises, and you will be arrested for trespassing if you return." Donovan stood frozen in the center of the marble foyer. A black garbage bag filled with silk suits slipped from his thick fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud. He looked at the bright yellow paper pinned to his front door. He looked out at his weeping daughter on the driveway. Then he looked at the fleet of moving trucks idling on his lawn, ready to erase every trace of his existence. The reality of his situation finally broke him. The federal fraud charges were pending. His corporate accounts were entirely frozen by the government. His creditors had seized every remaining asset he possessed. He had no cash, no leverage, and no friends left to call. Donovan stumbled forward. He walked out of the massive front doors and slowly descended the stone steps. His breathing was shallow and erratic. The commanding posture of the fierce real estate titan had vanished entirely, replaced by the hunched, trembling frame of a broken old man. He crossed the gravel driveway, walking directly toward where I stood, leaning against my SUV. My security detail instantly stepped forward to intercept him, but I raised a single finger, silently commanding them to hold their position. Donovan stopped 3 feet in front of me. He looked at my polished shoes, then up at my face. He did not see a scared teenager standing in the rain anymore. He saw the architect of his total destruction. His legs gave out. Donovan Caldwell collapsed onto the sharp gravel, dropping heavily to his knees right in front of me. Penelope Donovan rasped his voice, a pathetic, wet whisper. Please, I am begging you. The feds took my accounts. My cards are declining. I do not even have enough cash to rent a motel room tonight. I have nowhere to go. I am your father. You cannot leave me to die on the street. Please, Penelope, just give me one of the guest houses. Let me stay in the pool house. I will do anything. I looked down at the man who had ordered me to beg. I looked at the gravel biting into his knees. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment, ensuring he felt the full, crushing weight of his absolute surrender. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment, ensuring he felt the full, crushing weight of his absolute surrender. The morning wind whipped across the manicured lawns of the Briarwood estate, rustling the bare branches of the ancient oak trees and carrying the sharp, bitter scent of incoming frost. The flashing red and blue lights from the sheriff cruisers cast rhythmic, harsh shadows across Donovan Caldwell's face. His tailored suit pants were ruined, ground into the damp dirt and sharp stones of the driveway. His hands, usually busy pointing fingers or slamming gavels on boardroom tables, lay limp at his sides. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. There was no triumph, no rush of adrenaline, and certainly no pity. There was only the clinical satisfaction of watching a long overdue equation finally balance itself out. Penelope, please, Donovan whimpered, his voice cracking violently. The sound was pathetic, entirely devoid of the booming patriarchal authority he had wielded like a club my entire life. You are my daughter. I am your father. You have to listen to me. We are blood. He tried to reach out, his trembling fingers grazing the hem of my cashmere coat. I took a single, deliberate step backward. The crunch of my heel on the gravel sounded louder than a gunshot. He flinched, pulling his hand back as if he had been burned. Do not touch me, I stated, my voice dropping to a deathly quiet register that forced him to strain to hear it. You lost the right to call yourself my father 10 years ago. Donovan shook his head frantically, his jowls trembling. You do not mean that. You are angry and you have every right to be angry, but this has gone too far. You have proven your point. You won. You beat me. But you cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. You cannot put me on the street. It is inhumane. We are family, Penelope. Family protects family. Family. I repeated, testing the word on my tongue as if it were a foreign concept. I slowly scanned the chaotic scene around us. I looked at Cassidy, still weeping hysterically on the grass where her repossessed Mercedes used to sit. I looked at the moving trucks idling heavily on the driveway, their exhaust mingling with the cold air. Then I looked back down at the broken man kneeling at my feet. Where was this profound devotion to family when you threw me out into a torrential downpour, Donovan? I asked, my tone conversational but razor sharp. Where was this lecture on flesh and blood when I was 18 years old, shivering in wet clothes, begging you to let me back inside because I had nowhere else to go? You stood on that exact marble portico right behind me, and you watched me cry. You locked the heavy oak doors, and you went back to eating your dinner while I slept on a bus bench. Donovan squeezed his eyes shut. Tears of pure, selfish terror finally spilled over his lashes, cutting tracks through the dust on his flushed cheeks. I was trying to make you strong, he choked out, grasping desperately at the ghost of his former justifications. I was preparing you for the harshness of the world. Look at what you achieved. Look at the empire you built. You would never have founded Obsidian Financial if I had not pushed you. You owe your success to me. I made you a titan. The sheer delusional narcissism of his statement hung in the freezing air. Even now, kneeling in the dirt, completely stripped of his assets, his reputation and his freedom, he was trying to claim ownership of my victory. He genuinely believed his cruelty was a gift. I built my company despite you, not because of you, I corrected him, my voice devoid of any warmth. I built it so I would never ever have to rely on a manipulative, fraudulent tyrant for my survival. And I built it so I could return the favor you gave me. Donovan's chest heaved. He looked around wildly, seeing the sheriff standing stoically by their vehicles, their hands resting near their duty belts. He saw the repossession agent securing the chains on his daughter's car. He realized there was no hidden loophole, no sleazy lawyer waiting in the wings, and no bank manager he could bribe with a steak dinner. "Penelope, please. I am an old man," he wailed, his voice pitching upward into a full, humiliating sob. He leaned forward, pressing his palms flat against the gravel, bowing his head until it nearly touched my shoes. "The federal prosecutors are going to freeze my pension. I have absolutely nothing left. You owe me a roof over my head. I gave you life. You cannot just discard me." I stared down at the trembling, pathetic shell of Donovan Caldwell. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, the way he had sold Cassidy's financial future to save his own skin, and the sheer arrogance he had displayed in the courtroom just yesterday. He was not sorry for his crimes. He was only sorry he had been caught. I tilted my head, studying him with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a dying specimen under a microscope. "You loved giving me lectures about reality, Donovan," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through his pathetic sobbing. "You loved standing at the head of the dinner table and dictating how the world worked. Remember Thanksgiving right before you threw me into the storm? You told me the real world does not care about feelings. You told me that in the real world, weakness is punished and incompetence is evicted." Donovan looked up at me, his face twisted in absolute horror. He knew exactly what was coming. "Well, here is your final lesson," I stated, delivering the words with crushing, unapologetic finality. "In the real world, 64-year-old men who commit fraud do not get to live in $4 million estates. I will lend you $500 for a U-Haul." Donovan gasped, his mouth hanging open in silent, suffocating shock. The absolute finality of my statement struck him like a physical blow. The last tiny ember of hope in his eyes extinguished entirely, leaving behind nothing but the dark, terrifying reality of his ruined life. I did not wait for his response. I turned my head and caught the eye of the lead sheriff standing near the portico. I gave him a single sharp nod. "Time is up, Mr. Caldwell," the lead sheriff barked, stepping forward with heavy, purposeful strides. Two bulky deputies flanked him, marching directly toward where my father knelt in the gravel. "No, wait!" Donovan screamed, his voice shattering into a hysterical shriek as the deputies grabbed him roughly by the arms. "You cannot do this. This is my house. I built this estate. I am Donovan Caldwell. Get your hands off me." The deputies hauled his massive frame effortlessly to his feet. He thrashed wildly, his expensive suit tearing at the shoulder seam as he desperately tried to break free. He kicked at the gravel, his polished leather shoes slipping uselessly as they dragged him backward toward the iron gates. "Penelope, you cannot do this. I am your father." Donovan howled, his screams echoing off the stone facade of the mansion, disturbing a flock of crows resting in the bare trees. I completely ignored his pleas. I turned my back on the chaotic, humiliating spectacle. I walked past Cassidy, who was still curled in a miserable ball on the grass, unable to even look up as her father was physically thrown off the property. I walked up the wide, sweeping stone steps of the estate. I reached the top of the portico and stepped through the grand mahogany doors. The cavernous marble foyer stretched out before me, quiet, pristine, and entirely empty. The air inside smelled of expensive wax and total silence. I stood in the center of the grand entryway, letting the profound stillness of my new home wash over me. Outside, Donovan's frantic, desperate screams grew fainter as the sheriffs pushed him past the property line. I reached out and pulled the heavy oak doors shut. They closed with a solid, echoing thud, sealing away the past forever. 3 months later. The bitter, freezing winter that had marked the end of the Caldwell Empire had finally surrendered to a bright, vibrant spring. I stood in the center of the expansive Briarwood living room, adjusting the diamond clasp on my wrist. Across the room, a massive flat-screen television played the local evening news. The volume was low, but the bright red breaking news banner flashing urgently across the bottom of the screen was impossible to miss. Donovan Caldwell. The disgraced former real estate tycoon was sitting at a defense table wearing a shapeless, bright orange jumpsuit. The reporter's voice was crisp, clinical, and completely devoid of the reverence Donovan used to command. She was detailing the unsealing of a staggering 90-page federal indictment. The charges included systemic wire fraud, international money laundering, and interstate financial manipulation. The judge had labeled him an extreme flight risk and denied bail entirely. The man who once believed he owned the city, who had confidently forged his own daughter's signature to fuel his insatiable greed, was now a federal inmate staring down a mandatory 20-year sentence in a maximum security prison. The broadcast seamlessly transitioned to a shaky paparazzi-style cell phone video of Cassidy and Andre leaving a downtown family courthouse. It was a vicious, poverty-stricken spectacle that almost defied belief. Cassidy was screaming wildly at Andre on the public sidewalk. Her face was devoid of her signature flawless makeup, and her custom Chanel wardrobe had been replaced by faded generic sweatpants. She was currently living in a cramped 200-square-foot studio apartment above a noisy laundromat, surviving by attempting to sell her remaining heavily scuffed designer shoes on internet auction sites. Andre looked gaunt, terrified, and utterly defeated. He was clutching a battered synthetic leather briefcase. Following his public humiliation and the federal audit of his accounts, his prestigious law firm had fired him instantly. Disbarred and disgraced, he was now working 40 hours a week, reviewing mundane documents in a miserable, windowless basement office just to afford his basic rent. Their divorce had become a legendary toxic bloodbath in the local tabloids. They had absolutely zero assets left to split, no luxury cars to fight over, and no mansions to claim. Instead, they were spending their miserable days fighting savagely over who would assume the suffocating millions of dollars in combined debt they had racked up. They were drowning in the exact financial ruin they had tried to force onto me. I picked up the silver remote and clicked the television screen to black. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of remorse. They had dug their own graves with their greed, and now they were lying in them. I turned my attention away from the ghosts of the past and looked at the vibrant, beating heart of the present. Briarwood Estate was completely unrecognizable. I had spent the last 90 days methodically stripping the mansion of Donovan's oppressive, dark, heavy influence. The suffocating, arrogant oil paintings of old men and the intimidating mahogany antiques had been sold at auction or hauled directly to the landfill. The walls were now painted in bright, welcoming, luminous tones. The massive crystal chandeliers illuminated a space filled with warmth, life, and genuine purpose. Tonight was the inaugural charity gala for the Obsidian Financial Women's Initiative. I had purposely transformed the ultimate symbol of my father's toxic, fragile ego into a fortress of empowerment. We were raising critical funds to provide immediate legal representation and emergency capital for women escaping domestic and familial financial abuse. We were helping vulnerable women break the chains of hidden debt, forged signatures, and financially controlling partners. We were giving them the exact lifeline, the exact strategic weapon that I had been forced to build for myself from scratch. Elias Vance walked into the room holding 2 crystal flutes of vintage champagne. He handed one to me, offering a warm, deeply respectful smile. "The grand ballroom is completely packed, Penelope," Elias said, his voice echoing over the beautiful distant hum of a live string quartet. "The mayor is here, the governor just arrived, and our initial silent auction has already raised over $4 million. You completely rewrote the history of this estate in a single night." I accepted the champagne, offering Elias a nod of profound gratitude. I walked gracefully through the grand dining hall, acknowledging the bright smiles and respectful nods from powerful investors, brilliant legal minds, and brave survivors who now had a voice. I was no longer the discarded, pathetic daughter begging for a place at the table. I owned the table. I was the architect of my own empire. I stepped through the towering French doors and walked out onto the expansive marble balcony. The gentle evening breeze caught the edge of my silk emerald gown. I looked out over the rolling, perfectly manicured lawns of the estate. This was the exact spot where Donovan had tried to crush my spirit. This was the exact ground where he had dropped to his knees in the sharp gravel begging for mercy before being dragged away in handcuffs, kicking and screaming like a spoiled, powerless child. I rested my hands on the cool stone balustrade, taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip of champagne. Society spends so much time conditioning women to be the silent peacemakers. We are told to forgive the unforgivable. We are told to accept the meager scraps thrown to us by arrogant, entitled men just to keep the family harmony intact. We are expected to absorb their financial betrayals, smile politely through their condescension, and quietly clean up the toxic messes they leave behind. But I learned the ultimate truth the hard, brutal way. You cannot negotiate with parasites. You cannot compromise with people who only view you as a financial resource to be drained and discarded. You do not argue with toxic people who try to pull you down. You do not beg for their respect, and you certainly do not wait around for their fake apologies. You simply buy the ground they stand on and you evict them. You secure your own capital. You build your own fortress. You weaponize your intelligence and you strike back with such overwhelming, undeniable success that they are completely erased from the equation. Donovan and Cassidy thought they could use my bloodline as a leash. They thought familial obligation would blind me to their relentless fraud. But true power does not come from blood. True power comes from knowing your absolute worth and refusing to discount it for anyone. The heavy French doors opened behind me, and the joyous, triumphant sound of women laughing, networking, and celebrating spilled out onto the balcony. I turned around, leaving the darkness of the lawn behind forever, and walked back inside to join my real family. Have you ever had to set hard, uncompromising financial boundaries with toxic family members to protect your own future? Share your story in the comments below and remember that your financial independence is your ultimate armor. The story of the Briarwood Estate's downfall teaches a profound lesson true. Security is forged through independence, not toxic bloodlines. For decades, familial obligation and financial manipulation were weaponized to demand blind loyalty and silence. However, ultimate strength comes from recognizing your intrinsic worth and refusing to compromise with those who only seek to exploit you. Breaking free from emotional and financial abuse requires the fierce courage to set uncompromising boundaries and the resilience to build your own fortress from the ground up. You do not have to inherit your future, you can create it. Have you ever had to draw a hard line to protect your peace and independence? Share your story and comment below.